We'll move over to committee of the whole. I got the thumbs up from the back, the guys that are driving this ship. Is there any declaration of interest related to any matter on this agenda? Not seeing any. If one should arise, you can declare it at that time. Business arising from the minutes. Councillor DeBreen.
Good morning, Warden Milne and County Council. I am bringing this notice of motion forward to your endorsement for my application to the Amo County Caucus. I'm not sure, Warden Milne, of the process. Do I read the notice of motion aloud or does it stand in the agenda?
It's on the agenda and everyone has had a chance to read it. We do, however, need a seconder. I missed that. Councillor McQueen, thank you. So I don't think it's necessary to read it unless anybody online cannot see it. But as Councillor DeBreen has indicated, it is simply to endorse her application to seek a position on the AMO board. Councillor Gregg.
Thanks, Warden. My only question is, and I have no problem with supporting it, it's the procedural question I have. So it was mentioned, I guess my first question is, and it was just highlighted. I was coming in here and I'm like, do we not need a seconder for notices of motion? And there wasn't a seconder because the notices weren't presented formally. The wording last meeting was notice of motion, which doesn't really exist. And if you're presenting the notice of motion, then at that time you're prepared and you have a seconder before it would advance onto the agenda today. And being that there's a second one on here, that's the backdrop to my question. So because there is a time constraint for Councillor DeBreen's motion, I guess procedurally, would we not be better addressing that under notices of motion and then just waiving the notice of motion clause at that time? That's just what I'm looking for some clarity on.
That is a very good question and I have no idea. So I'm going to defer to the clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Councillor DeBreen at the last meeting provided, as you say, a notice of motion that was going to come forward to this meeting. So she provided the general content of what her motion would be. And the formal notice was provided through the agenda dated February 9th. So generally what we've done is a notice is provided at a prior meeting and that formal motion is brought forward on the agenda at the next one and does require a seconder and a mover at that time.
Okay with that, Councillor Gregg?
Yeah, so you can get an item on the agenda previous to requiring a seconder for that to occur.
Okay, so the motion is on the floor and is seconded. Councillor McQueen.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. In two parts is you have to get a seconder to get it in discussion point today. So if you didn't, if the notice of motion that was announced came forward, but you didn't get support around here, then the motion would be lost. It wouldn't get to the table, right? Just speaking to the motion, very pleased to second this motion. I served from 2015 to 2022 on AMO as the county caucus and county caucus chair. So I'm pleased that somebody else is putting their name forward, Barbara. And if you need any comments or any from my experience beyond there, I certainly would share those if you have any questions, but certainly support this notice of motion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Councillor McQueen. Any other discussion? Councillor Eccles.
Just for my clarity, so this is to get Councillor DeBreen onto the ballot, and this will be voted on at the AMO meeting in August.
Correct. Well,
that's what we're looking at, or is she taking over something?
there is an interim step. There's two steps to this. There's one, she needs support. Well, she doesn't need support from the council here to actually be considered for the ballot, I believe. But then she does need a motion of support to actually be on the ballot. Am I correct in that? Yes, so she's proactively asking for the support prior to going through that process. Right? Okay, so. Councilor McQueen.
Right again. I know when I came on, it was Duncan McKinley had been on, and then a lot of times halfway through an election, people don't get reelected, or the spaces come up available. And this one, I think there was 2 spaces for county caucus and a staff person as well. And generally what happens is, yes, I think the deadline is tomorrow. Has to be submitted, and then that'll go to the full board and then the board will pick out of the roster. And that will move it forward. And Council is correct. The next step will be not this AMO, but the following conference. It's usually for appointment of 2 years, which would have been last August, but they didn't get enough people submitting for this particular. I think there's a couple other caucuses that were missing the numbers. So this will be decided by the board and is an interim to the next phase, which will be 2024, I think, August of 2024, with that 2-year period. It's a 2-year appointment, but you have to have the endorsement through notice in order to be on that consideration. Normally, it would be you would put your name for it. So going on to 2024, if Barbara's successful and she wishes to continue to that election, she'll have to get another motion here at the county to support her continuing on. So.
Alrighty. Now that we've, Councillor DeBreen.
Thank you, Warden Milne, and thank you, County Council, for your consideration. All great questions. The phase of this interim appointment is because of vacancies due to not being filled or people not being reelected. It is the endorsement isn't required at this early stage. It's only if you make it past the first cut. But I thought I would be proactive and not waste a lot of time. If I didn't have the endorsement of our County Council, then I would not proceed with my application tomorrow morning. Thank you very much for your consideration.
Very good, thank you. So are we ready for the question? I think so. Are we all in favor? That is carried. Thank you very much, and good best of luck to you, Councillor DeBreen, on that. I'm sure you'll be
Thank you.
successful. Committee of the Whole, Councillor McQueen had brought forward a notice of motion to be considered at this meeting, but he has asked that to be deferred until the Committee of the Committee of Redevelopment meets on the 21st to get more information, as much information in front of council prior to considering the notice of motion. Are you still okay with that, Councillor McQueen? Go ahead.
Well, it was more to the one that was on February 2nd, but certainly that will also, but I will have to get that notice of motion in Monday, I think, isn't it? Yeah, to be on the February 23rd meetings.
Okay, good. So I see the delegation is scheduled for 10:45. Shall we let's move on to the consent agenda, although I see Andrew online, but let's do the consent agenda first. There may be some folks in the listening audience that know that or see that the report will be at 10:45. So we'll try to get as close to that if you don't mind waiting, Andrew. Thank you very much. So the consent agenda is there. Can I have a motion to approve the consent agenda? Or rather, sorry, are there any items wishing to be withdrawn? Councillor McQueen.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Warden. Item D, with regards to the terms of reference for the Agriculture Advisory Committee.
Okay, thank you. Any other items wish to be removed? Not seeing any. I'll ask for a motion to receive the consent agenda. Councillor Nielsen and Councillor Dickard. Thank you very much. All those in favor? That is carried. Okay. So we have, let's go to, because the item A for discussion is directly related to the presentation. Let's go to item B, the additional residential unit resource guide. Becky Hillier is here. Let's, if Becky, if you're all right with that, let's proceed to that item. If There are no objections. Not seeing any. Good morning, Becky, and welcome. The floor is yours. Oh, sorry, the clerk has just reminded me I do, however, need a mover and a seconder. Councillor Hutchison and Councillor Body, thank you.
Good morning, County Council. For those of you who I haven't met before, my name is Becky Hillier. I am the intermediate planner with Grey County's Planning Department. And I'm going to do a little bit something new for our department today, which is to provide a bit of a good news without a technical PowerPoint. It's a bit of a new look for us. But I'm just going to be speaking in regards to report PDR CW-11-23. So that's in relation to a county partnership with University of Guelph master's students in relation to the creation of a ARU resource guide. So just so we're all on the same page, an ARU, or an additional residential unit, is essentially a self-contained residential unit that exists alongside of a primary residential use. So that might be in the form of something, for example, a basement apartment with its own kitchen and entrance. It could be potentially an accessory apartment above a garage, or it could even just be sort of its own self-contained smaller building in an accessory structure on a property. And so through Bill 23, as most of you will probably be aware of, was received royal assent in October 2022. One of the changes that was implemented through that act was in relation to additional residential units within the Planning Act. And so basically, at the moment, the Planning Act stipulates that no municipal official plan shall prohibit the use of up to 3 residential units on a serviced residential property. So by serviced, we mean within our primary settlement areas where there is that full municipal sewer capacity and water capacity. And I would note that in previous versions of the Planning Act, there was not necessarily that provision that kind of limited or focused ARUs in relation to those serviced settlement areas, but could potentially be more broadly applied to rural areas as well. And so at this point, the Grey County planning staff are quite enthusiastic about ARUs. We see the benefit of these units both within our service settlement areas and potentially in our more rural areas as well, and perhaps on a more kind of limited scale and with some additional planning considerations around servicing. But we recognize at this point, there's been a lot of changes over the past year or so within the planning realm. So Bill 23 it really brought in a lot of changes to municipalities and the way that they handle planning applications, as well as Bill 109. And so recognizing that our municipalities are really grappling with how to implement some of those changes, the county staff were wondering if there's opportunity for us to take a bit of a leadership role in doing some of that heavy lifting in terms of developing those policy provisions for additional residential units that could then be applied within municipal official plans and zoning bylaws. And so in that respect, we have partnered with a team of 3 students from the University of Guelph Masters in Rural Planning and Development program. And they're sort of going full swing at the moment with a project that will be looking to engage with our local municipal staff in most or all of our municipalities, which will include our planning, municipal planners, potentially building officials, or engineering or road staff, to get a good sense of kind of where our municipalities at with work that they've already done to implement ARUs at a zoning level or official plan level. What kind of requests are they seeing for these units? And are there kind of key questions or concerns in their mind as they're reviewing these requests that they feel, deserve a little bit of further consideration. Some municipalities in gray are really leaders, and they've really done the work in implementing some of these policies to date. And I think that we can learn a lot from them. And other municipalities, just due to different staffing levels, are certainly in a position to learn from other municipalities. And so we're really excited about this project. Again, we think ARUs have the potential to really increase the supply of rental housing options within the county. They have the opportunity to promote intergenerational family living, aging in place for our older adults, and they really do make efficient use of available municipal servicing within our settlement areas. So we're quite excited in that respect. And in terms of next steps, students will be reaching out in the next couple of weeks to our municipal staff. They'll be looking to conduct some interviews on ARUs and kind of local experiences. And then towards sort of the beginning of April, they would be submitting a final report as part of their coursework, which would come to us as well. And from there, we'd probably do a little bit of review of the work that they've done before we kind of more generally widely circulate that. So I just wanted to kind of reach out and say that we are moving forward with developing that draft interview schedule. And so if there are any kind of thoughts or ideas that anyone has that they think are a particularly important piece regarding ARUs to be inquiring about or to be sharing about, we're certainly open to feedback at this point in that respect. But otherwise, I think we are looking forward to this. And I will just say that the county has partnered with University of Guelph students in the past, as well as Waterloo and Toronto students on a variety of projects. I think there's been some contributions to our climate policy that we've done, to our age-friendly work that we've done. And so they've been really fruitful collaboration. And, one of the best parts as well is that unlike working with a consultant, which, would cost many thousands of dollars, the students are, working in partnership with us for free, essentially. So we think it's quite a good mutual benefit to all partners involved. But I will leave it with that. But if anyone has any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Becky. And I may be biased, but I think anybody that's had anything to do with the University of Guelph does good work. Go Griffins. Anyway, are there any questions? Councillor Matrosovs, go ahead.
Thank you, Warden Milne. Through you to staff, I would just like, I read the report. I'm excited. It sounds like a great initiative, but I would like some consideration into bringing in the Niagara Escarpment Commission discussion on this. 50% of our geography in our municipality falls under the NEC. And at the moment, even with the new 2017 NEC plan, we are not allowed to have secondary units in detached buildings, in accessory buildings. So unlike what we're doing at the county level, unlike what we're doing, I think, across our municipalities, as we're making those adjustments, it can be a very missed opportunity, because when rural properties have the space, they might have an existing accessory building that could contribute to housing solutions. If we're under the NEC, we're banned from that unless it's attached to the main dwelling. So I think that definitely needs to be part of our county conversation in developing this, because so much of our county falls under the Niagara Escarpment Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Matrosovs. Excellent point. Becky, do you want to respond at all?
Yes, thank you so much. That's a great point, and that actually hadn't been on my radar to reach out to NEC planning staff. So I think that's something we could definitely look at doing. I will just say we do agree that I think that there is merit in looking at opportunities where we can locate those ARUs in our more rural areas. And that said, I think there are, from kind of a general planning consideration, some general concerns about rural land use and things like our minimum distance separation in relation to, our barns and our natural heritage components as well, like our woodlands and our wetlands and that type of thing, as well as a big thing has been our on-farm diversified uses throughout Grey County. So if someone's situating an industrial use on their rural agricultural property, what are the implications for someone who's living in a residential unit adjacent to that use? So I think that it is a slightly more complex, nuanced issue for ARUs in our rural areas. But that said, I know that's something that, across Ontario, everyone is looking at and grappling with at this moment. And I think it's certainly worth looking at how we can make the most of those opportunities while balancing those other, the need to create space for those other rural land use considerations.
Thank you for that. Any other comments? Councillor McQueen.
Thank you, Mr. Warden, and thank you for coming forward with this. Just going on to the NEC part, certainly under the 2017 plan, it's only recognized under the rural designation of the NEC, nothing else. And I know that the protected lands, I think, is probably a big part of what the mayor of Blue Mountains is speaking to as well, and the same in Grey Highlands and Chatsworth and Georgian Bluff as well. It's the same designation. So going back to the part that was passed last fall with regards to the ability to have 2 secondary units on a property, going back to the rural side, we certainly have an influx of more and more C4s, and the issue around employment and finding employment or employees for those C4s, which ties into the part of the rural part. It's an issue, housing not only in an urban setting, but on a rural part and also age in place and aging families too. We had many times when I was on the NEC where we'd have situations, whether it be a farm on the Niagara Escarpment area, and they would like to have the ability to have the senior family still stay on the farm along with, and there was issues, there was conflict. It would not allow that. So up until last fall, we would allow a secondary unit on a rural lot. And so then we changed it to allow 2 on a rural lot. So is this a little different than that from what we approved? Or is this more to take 1 building and add 3 units? Is that sort of what this is more to speak to? Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that. So my understanding is, so there was a previous legislation called Bill 108, which was approved in 2019. And so that was sort of the more recent or somewhat recent change to the Planning Act. And through that act, I believe what happened was that municipalities had to develop OP or zoning provisions that would permit up to 2 units within the main dwelling unit, a total of 2 units, and then potentially an additional unit within an accessory structure. So the current changes to the Planning Act through Bill 23, they've just been slightly altered where 3 units could be situated within the main dwelling unit, or 1 could still be situated within an accessory structure. And so, but again, the Bill 23 ones are more focused on those uses within a service settlement area. So it's slightly up to the municipalities about whether or not they want to extend those ARU provisions outside of those service settlement areas. So there's nothing within the act from our perspective that would restrict those from being located on rural properties, but it's not something at this point from our perspective that municipalities would have to do. Through the county's OPA 11, which is currently under appeal, but hopefully will be in effect soon. The changes that we have kind of provided through that change to our official plan would permit up to those 2 additional residential units on our rural properties and our agricultural properties. The only caveat to that is that if a rural privately serviced property is less than 0.4 hectares. There are some concerns with nitrate loading in relation to private servicing. And so we would request that a nitrate study be undertaken just to make sure that there are no implications for groundwater or surrounding properties.
There we go. So, yeah, thank you for that. And I think we experienced one with 0.4 hectares recently. So I think from a Grey County perspective, there's a lot of rural lands. And certainly from our schools and community centers and arenas, people are important as well. And that's, on that perspective. So I certainly support moving forward with that opportunity to look at how we make it work.
Okay, Counselor DeBreen, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Warden Milne. And through you to Becky. We've already implemented or allowed for secondary units in an accessory structure, garden suites, secondary unit in home in our agricultural rural areas. I hear what you're saying. This is up to 3 in an urban settlement area. Are there conditions that need to be met with regard to that when water and wastewater capacity, parking may be of a concern or inability to provide? Because that's really going to affect municipalities' capacity numbers, assign those units. I do have a follow-up question on another matter on
Thank you, Counselor DeBreen. Becky, I know that broke up a little bit. Did you get enough of that yeah, I think you knew. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that, Counselor DeBreen. I would say that those are very much important questions that I think all of our municipalities are grappling with. And, as from the parking perspective, many of our municipalities are quite rural. And it might be tricky to create those units without that parking. That said, I think we want to be aware as well of the type of demographics who might be most likely to make use of ARUs. They might be more likely to be our older adult population who might not be inclined to drive too much. They could be our college students who may not own a vehicle. They may be sort of our lower socioeconomic status families who, again, may not own a vehicle. Through some of the desktops work and study that I've done on this, I have seen quite a few examples, including within kind of more rural municipalities and counties, where they've taken an approach of requiring that one parking space be provided for up to 2 additional residential units on a property. And in some cases, if it is an area that's well served by public transportation, some municipalities have taken the approach of not requiring additional parking spaces for those units. So I think it can and should be quite a case-by-case example or a case-by-case review of what those provisions should look like on a quite a local scale. But yes, I certainly hear you. And to the servicing piece, I agree that I think that's a question that quite a lot of building official, engineering, planning staff are grappling with as well. If suddenly the density of an existing neighborhood is doubling because of additional residential units, what does that look like from a servicing capacity perspective? So I think, those are important questions. That I think will hopefully receive a bit more reflection and responses through this study.
follow-up, Warden Milne.
You had a follow-up question, Counselor DeBreen? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Through you. I wanted to echo Councillor McQueen's comments about the rural gardens, but elaborate a little further. I've always questioned the provincial policy statement that restricts the garden suite to a 20-year window. If we're going to allow secondary units or additional residential units in an accessory dwelling without a time frame, why would that stand? Is there an opportunity to look at eliminating that 20-year limit, especially for farm families, additional rental income for farmers, aging in place, students? I also question or agree that the additional units within the urban setting really does tie to those that have transit, which we often don't in rural Ontario. We are very fortunate to have that pilot program, but it is limited at this time. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much for that. So just in regards to that garden suite piece, I would just clarify. So the way that we have defined ARUs within our OPA 11 change to our official plan is that we would consider those as actually permanent units as opposed to garden suites. That said, we do think that there is merit in allowing those short-term garden suite temporary use bylaws. And the reason for that is because as we were developing some of this ARU research, we had some conversations with a tiny house consultant, essentially. And she basically spoke to the fact that a lot of people that she works with are, they own their own unit essentially, and it's sort of a semi-mobile unit, and they're just looking for land to locate it. And a lot of municipalities don't permit that. And so, I think that this needs to be done with a degree of caution, and we need to make sure that, we're only approving units that are safe and that can be permanently livable for people or habitable in all seasons, I should say. But we think that there is merit in exploring kind of land lease models that allow someone to locate a kind of semi-mobile unit on a rural property, provided it's connected to the rural servicing that is available there, because it essentially owns people, or it allows people to own an asset, which is the unit that they're living in, but to have a degree of flexibility in where that is actually located. So unlike that kind of purely rental model where tenants are potentially at risk of getting kicked out of their home, it's something that it could essentially go with them. So it's not my area of expertise, and from what I understand, there's all sorts of considerations from a building code perspective of permitting that type of use. But I do think kind of at the local level, it might be worth planners and building officials kind of putting their heads together to figure out, if that is an approach that they would be wanting to take within developing their own municipal zoning bylaws in that respect.
Thank you, Becky. Councillor Body, you had a comment.
Ms. Hilliard just kind of hit my point, but this is going to be fascinating in practice. Building codes, fire separation, fire escape, separation of heating systems, loads on water, wastewater, well, septic. There's going to be a lot of requirements, I think, to actually put these into practice that will be interesting. And I'm going to be fascinated to see the reaction of the neighborhood, the way we've seen the reaction to Airbnbs when the first one goes in and a couple of cars start parking on the street in front of the house. And it's going to be interesting. We're getting them. It's been a decision from the province, whether we like it or not. I would have rather have had it more of these things being a local decision to look at all the consequences, but it'll be fascinating as it moves forward, and they may not be just as easy to do. Thanks.
Indeed, the laws of unintended consequences are alive and well, I'm sure. Becky, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I would just commend the city for a lot of the proactive work that they've done in this respect. And yeah, I think it will be great to learn from them and the work that they have put in place already within their official plans and zoning bylaws. So we look forward to those discussions.
Counselor Eccles.
Thank you, and probably further on to add on to what Councillor Body had said. In the municipality of West Gray, probably 30 or 40 years ago or longer than that, I think there's other municipalities that are out there, but I do know of at least a half a dozen rural properties that have 2 houses built on them. Never separated or anything like that. There's 2 houses there, which under today's planning rules wouldn't be allowed. And for good reason. It's never the first owner of the house, but the complications that end coming from that on sometimes the second owner or the third owner. There's enough issues in municipal politics without having to deal with neighbor disputes. And there's nothing worse than having a shared driveway and 2 houses, and who hasn't got it plowed out, who created the potholes in it. And I think it was Councillor DeBreen that just said, you know, rural Ontario, especially rural Grey County, we've had garden suites, and it seems like, and you've said it yourself, Ms. Healer, that we need these for some of our senior residents or from senior family members. And the garden suite was, I think, an absolute perfect way to resolve the issue. But again, we have some policymakers and some legislative individuals in Queen's Park. You probably have heard me say this a couple of times, and in the next 3.5 years, I'll repeat it many times. Provincial policy cannot deal 100% with 100% of Ontario. Rural Ontario is different than downtown Toronto. Rural Ontario, southern part of Grey County, is different than Waterloo region. But the province has come out with this aspect. I'm glad that I'm not a University of Guelph graduate at this point in time to come and deal with this, that I graduated, okay, I'll say it, in the 70s, and didn't have to deal with this because I can, it's going to be, I think, more than interesting, Mr. Body, on how we end up dealing with this. There's a lot of confusion. It's certainly not a wonderful, let's get at it and get to work building more houses. A lot of complications going to be in it. Thank you for allowing me the rant.
Yep, we're sure we'll never hear any more. Becky, did you want to respond?
We all need that ranting space sometime. I feel that. Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I would just again mention, so again, through Bill 23, it would appear that municipalities are not obligated to permit ARUs, and in rural areas, it is the policy speaks specifically to the serviced settlement areas. So again, municipalities do have the opportunity to finesse their own local zoning of whether or not that is something that they want to do. I agree with you that there are, some concerns in regards to how and where those units should be situated. I personally think of kind of the long-term property costs associated with them. Like if at a point those lands are sold, what is the cost for, a new farmer trying to buy them? So in that regard, there might be some merit in our rural areas to making sure the size of any ARU is quite limited in size or scale. Maybe there's opportunity to only locate them within the existing farmhouse. So I think that there are opportunities to kind of finesse that at a local level, but yeah, I hear you that there are some concerns.
We are at past 10:45, so I'll give you the last comment, Councillor McQueen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Warden, but I think we have to look at today's reality. Today's reality, the price of housing for young people today is way out of whack. Way high, and this is an opportunity to create those opportunities. I think for seniors or those that want to stay in place, I think age in place is the best thing going. So I think there has to be some flexibility. I certainly think maybe 25, 30, 40 years ago, when some of these residential units were put on 2 properties or 2 farms, they didn't have MDS. MDS is in place for today as well to help some of those conflict of areas. But I don't know if you have a young family that's wants, and you know, young families maybe don't want to be in the same unit as mom and dad or others. You know, they want some space. Same with the senior side as well. So you got to have some flexibility there, and we got to think outside the box. Provincial policy is being reviewed, as I understand right now. They mentioned that at Roma, they're doing a review on the provincial policy. So yeah, one size does not fit all, but there's has to be enough flexibility in that provincial policy that allows what you're maybe trying to do here. So I think we have to look at the affordability of that of housing and for young people today. And we, you know, I remember all the years I've been in municipal government, is the big question is, how do we keep our young people here? How do we create opportunities for them to stay here instead of having to leave our community and work somewhere else? So I think housing is one part of that, and housing is very expensive. So we have to have some flexibility on creating opportunities for young and old. And however, we want to bring other people into our community as well. As far as I know, was mentioned Airbnbs, but part of the opportunity with secondary units is also an income level or an income stream to keep that rural land in place. So I think there's a lot of benefits here, and you know, this is 2023, not 1975 as well. So we have to look at ahead. Thank you.
Actually, I'll give you the last word, Becky, if you choose.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I don't have too much further to say. I don't know if Randy or Scott has anything. No. Okay. Yeah, nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky, and we certainly look forward to the report from the students. Okay, now we'll go back to item. Sorry. Oh, sure. I guess we'll vote on that. I was kind of thinking we're all agreement. All those in favor of receiving that? Okay, that is carried. Thank you very much. Details. So come on up, Kevin. We're ready to start our delegation. So I'll give the floor to you to introduce our guests, and we'll go from there.
Good morning, Warden and County Council. I'm pleased to have Andrew Gregan here this morning with us from ORH, Operational Research and Health. This is the organization that has been completing our comprehensive deployment review. Andrew was here in October in person, actually, as he was traveling through the province, and presented to the previous county council and gave the results that they had to date. And but they had more work to do at that time, particularly around the phasing of what it would look like to respond to the demands that they found during the report. So Andrew's going to be with us probably for about the next hour, and he'll be talking about the report and the findings. He will be letting you know about questions. He will take questions at different points throughout and at the end. So for now, I'll just hand it off to Andrew.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chief. Good morning, Council. Good morning, Warden. Good morning, councillors. Thanks very much for allowing me to speak today and inviting me to this meeting. I'm just going to hopefully share my screen, and please let me know if you can see it. I've got the presentation up with me. Is everyone able to see that screen now?
Yeah, we're good. We can see it well. Andrew, thank you.
Excellent. So yes, thank you for inviting me this morning. As the Chief said, today I'm going to talk through, similarly to those of you who were in the room back in October, I'm going to talk through kind of the process to our review, why I'm here today, then our findings and recommendations effectively to the paramedic service. I will, as Kevin just said, be stopping at a couple of points throughout just to make sure that we can wrap up any questions, because there are, there's a lot of detail to go through as ever. So I'll stop around slide 19, which is just after some of the analysis, and then I'll stop again around slide 40, kind of between modelling sections, and then there should be time at the end for any questions then. So today I'll go through a little introduction, and then we're going to focus on the recommendations to start with, and then really build up the evidence for why we come with those recommendations to the paramedic service, and why that's been then taken on into Kevin's report. That'll go through some of the analysis, some of the demand projections, various modelling scenarios, including the phasing to work out how we get to the kind of future position. And I'll also talk about the support services and organisational structure. So firstly, just a little bit about the review, the objective. So we are here to help develop a comprehensive master plan for paramedic services with a kind of 10-year time horizon, so through to 2033. That includes a written report, currently in draft final stage, with an executive summary and a presentation. I did do on-site presentation in October and a presentation here again. Within that report, there are 5 main items effectively. Looking at ambulance call forecasts, so how many calls or incidents do we expect in the future over those 10 years? What response time targets should we set? What resourcing requirements are needed to meet those response time targets given those ambulance call forecasts? Then it's about what does that mean in terms of facilities, where are they, how large might they be? And also there's a handover of the modelling tool, which I'll talk about, which is our kind of in-house developed modelling tool that Grey County Paramedic Services now actually have and can use. So just a little bit briefly about who ORH are, Operational Research and Health, as Kevin said. So we're a small consultancy based in the UK, not too far from London. And we work predominantly with the public sector, and within that almost entirely with the emergency services, that being ambulance or paramedic services, police and fire services also. Our remit effectively is to help those services understand how they can potentially be more effective and be more efficient and optimize their resource usage. We work a lot, particularly for ambulance and paramedic services in the UK, also quite a lot in Ontario, worked with quite a few neighbouring services of yours, Huron, Bruce, Guelph, Wellington and Simcoe actually. So from more rural services, somewhat similar to yours, through to kind of Middlesex, London, and also York Region paramedic services. Also work a little bit in the US and quite a lot in Australia and New Zealand. So hopefully bringing some insights from paramedic services and ambulance services across the world. For this review and a few other reviews, we've also partnered with the Ambulance Association of Chief Executives, who are similar to the Paramedic Chiefs of Canada here in the UK, and they help us with consultancy work on the kind of support services, organisational structure, and that kind of side of things. So I'll talk through some of their recommendations too. So firstly, just in terms of the recommendations out there first, so I'll explain, through the analysis and through the demand projections, through the modelling, how we've got to these recommendations. But just to start off, our first one is to phase in resources, that being ambulances, in line with the modelling we've undertaken, with the aim of maintaining current levels of performance through to 2033, and being cognizant of the differences in performance by municipality and area. One of the strengths, I think, of this type of review with the handover of AMSIM, our modelling tool, is that Grey County are able to test out, if some of the assumptions or some of the analysis, something changes, what does that mean for paramedic services in terms of performance and how many staff and vehicles they need in future. In terms of that phasing, what we've produced, what we suggested, is in 2024 a 12-hour day shift, additional 12-hour day shift at both Owen Sound and Hanover. 2025, a new location in Feversham with a 12-hour day shift there, and that includes upstaffing the first response unit through, and an additional 12-hour shift at Meaford. 2027, an additional 12-hour late shift at Owen Sound. 2029, a day shift at Durham. 2031, a night shift at Owen Sound, and then 2033, a 12-hour day shift at Craigleith. Now that's based on, and we'll go into more detail, the demand projections we've produced, and I know there's been some questions on demand projections that I'll go through at that point also. This is with the aim of, as I've just said, really maintaining performance by municipality as much as possible through to 2033. So this is our suggestion based on the demand projections as they sit now. As I said, if things change, Grey County can be quite agile and adapt and test out, actually, do things need to move in a different order, perhaps, depending on what happens in terms of population and demand growth and things like that. We've looked at the supervisor ratio, so not just thinking about frontline staff, but frontline supervisors, operational supervisors. To maintain the current ratio would mean that 2 additional supervisors would be required. The current ratio is quite similar to similarly sized services we've worked with in Ontario. There's also the suggestion from the Associated Ambulance Chief Executives side of the work to potentially look as the service grows, and this really applies across Ontario, not just particularly in Grey County, but as the service grows, to consider whether a separate clinical supervision framework as opposed to a frontline management framework could be utilised as well, something that works well, we know, over here in Australia and a few other places across the world. We also think there could be increased integration with frontline paramedics, with community paramedicine in future, should the wider Ontario paramedic system change in future. It's something we've talked about in various reviews of ours, that we know there are changes afoot and some changes have already happened. But if there is a larger change, Ontario-wide scale change in dispatch system and deployment models, that would allow greater integration with community paramedicine, things like treat and release and treat and refer, with the ultimate aim of better patient care and kind of better flow throughout the entire healthcare system. We also think there's a case for an additional scheduler within operations. So at the moment, the schedulers work kind of business hours, Monday to Friday. That means that out of hours and evenings and weekends, that role effectively falls to frontline supervisors who have their more kind of day-to-day role also to undertake. As the service grows in particular, consideration should be towards looking at whether there could be an additional role in what is currently out of hours. There's also potentially a need for an additional logistics depot or space effectively within a different part of Grey County. The current space is at capacity effectively. This would give more capacity, business continuity if it was elsewhere, and spreading things around effectively to make sure that drive times to get whatever supplies are needed are reduced. There's also the potential as well then to consider spare vehicle capacity, because as we increase frontline resources, staff, vehicles, there's obviously a need for spare vehicles to make sure you have a spare in case you need it. So now I'm just going to go through some of the analysis summaries. So I'll try and explain the kind of format of each slide as well as the kind of the point of each slide. So first thing we tend to look at within a paramedic service is demand. And when we say demand, that note at the top right there, we are talking about incidents which had a response from Grey County Paramedic Services. Within the kind of data set we have, we can also see responses from other services, and that's something we've looked at, and we can also see responses from Grey County going out of county. We tend to focus on incidents that get a response from Grey County Paramedic Services. I know that some terminology sometimes looks at responses and mobilizations, which will be higher than incidents. This is effectively the number of patients that Grey County Paramedic Services respond to. Main point here, so the lines on the graph we're showing, so there's code 4 in red and code 3 in yellow are the main two to kind of focus on, code 4 being the kind of life-threatening emergencies. Since, well, post-pandemic, effectively post-2020, there has been, hopefully you can see my mouse, like kind of steady rise in those calls, along with a steady rise in code 3 calls as well. That's something we've seen across the world in the reviews we've undertaken. So not something necessarily unique to Grey County, but after, I guess, some years of a few ups and downs, considering what's been happening through 2020 and 21 in particular, fairly steady increase since then through 2022. We've also looked at demand for different seasons. Something I think that's relatively unique within Grey County is the Blue Mountains municipality, where we do see pretty much double the number of incidents per day occurring in that kind of winter peak season compared to other seasons in the year. There are seasonal differences in many different areas, but perhaps not quite as stark as in the Blue Mountains municipality, with around 7 incidents a day, code 1 through to code 4 in December to February on average, more like 3 to around 3 for the rest of the year. Less of, so hopefully these colors highlight here the differences, red being negative, and the darker the red, the more negative. The lighter the blue, or the darker the blue, sorry, the more positive. There aren't many other changes that are, well, there are no other changes that are more than 1 decimal point. So really Blue Mountains being quite a unique area in terms of the change in demand that you see by season. One of the, I think, key conversations we have with a lot of reviews, and one that I don't think necessarily presents a huge challenge at the moment in Grey County, but is worth noting, is around time at hospital or offload delays. We know it's a challenge across the world with paramedic services at the moment, and has been really since the pandemic. We've looked at that in every service we worked in, and like I say, I don't think it presents a huge challenge, and we've done some testing around that I'll come to later on. I don't think it presents a huge challenge in Grey County. However, if we show the line here, this is the average time spent at hospital for Owen Sound, Grey Bruce Health Services in Owen Sound Hospital. We can see that before 2020, before the pandemic, really around 20 minutes, if we read off this blue line, or under 20 minutes in most cases, has been, increased during the pandemic, we'd probably expect, but has increased since then also, to actually now around the point of Collingwood Hospital, which I know you take patients to, particularly from that Blue Mountains kind of area. This isn't significant in terms of the amount of time spent there, and we'll come on to some benchmarking that compares this to other paramedic services in Ontario. Don't think this is significant in comparison to some others, but it still is increasing from where it used to be before 2020. So it could present a challenge in the future. Now just looking at response performance. So there are 2 kind of main ways for us to categorize incidents within Ontario. The kind of priority or code system, where code 4 is for life-threatening emergencies, and we're showing only code 4s here. But there's also the Canadian Triage Acuity Scale, or CTAS, which runs 1 or sometimes 0 with sudden cardiac arrest, to 5 with the lower the number, the more acute the patient, the more severe the patient. This top table just shows us the average number of incidents a day that are within those different CTAS scales. Relatively few CTAS 1 incidents, more in CTAS 2 and CTAS 3. The bottom table shows the different performance measures that Grey County measure and report against. CTAS 1 being 60% within 8 minutes. And here we show it by municipality, whether the number is above or below that 60% mark. And Grey County are only required to report that at a county level, but obviously for us, I think it's important to understand how that varies by municipality, because there is quite a variation between some of the more urban areas and some of the more rural areas. Next measure as well, important to note, is the CTAS 2 performance, which is a 15-minute target 90% of the time. CTAS 1 performance has over the last few years on average met that standard and exceeded it. CTAS 2 has very much been, some years below the 90%, some years above the 90%, very much around that kind of 90% figure on average. But in a relatively rural service like Grey County, we think it's important to look at both the 8-minute measure in the more urban areas and the 15-minute measure in some of the more rural areas, to make sure we're understanding the different travel times and kind of density of incidents and population. Hopefully this map depicts that. So what this shows is for those code 4 non-transfer calls, so not calls that are from hospital to hospital, so a patient in the community effectively. This is for all responses within Grey County. The darker the green, which is generally around the stations, the faster the time. If it's a green color, it's within 8 minutes. If it's a kind of blue fading out to lighter blue, that's within or between 8 and 15 minutes. And then if it's over 15 minutes, that's that kind of orange to red. What we wanted to show here is clearly in somewhere like Owen Sound, performance is generally very good within 8 minutes. But that's quite an urban area, quite a cluster of demand, which you can see from these kind of grey circles here that are dotted around the map, compared to some of the more rural areas, particularly thinking Grey Highlands. We can see here that actually in some of the more rural areas, quite a few incidents sit in the kind of blue 8 to 15 minute area, but also particularly for Grey Highlands, quite a few sit outside that kind of range, towards the kind of east or northeast of Grey Highlands there, and also in Southgate too. So what we're looking for here are there patterns of demand that are within and close to stations, within good response time, and then some of the longer drive times just by necessity, the kind of sparsity of the population effectively. So we tend to look throughout the rest of the presentation at 8-minute performance in the more urban areas and 15-minute performance in the rural areas. We want to look at both and a variety of measures, because we don't want to focus on just one single number, and we don't want to just focus on the Grey County wide number also. One thing we looked at is the workload by station. So this just breaks that down for codes 1 to 4, and then also code 8. Code 8 being standby moves, so where there's a move to cover another station because maybe one vehicle has gone out to respond to an incident. As we'd expect, Owen Sound responds to the most incidents, but actually some of the stations that respond to relatively few incidents a day, kind of between the 2 and 3 mark, more than half their responses are actually on standby moves, priority 8 or code 8 calls. So that's where they are being used rather than necessarily to respond to patients. They're moving to other areas to cover stations when those stations are not covered. This is relatively similar. We've looked at this kind of standby usage compared to other similar services in Ontario. So although some of those stations are doing quite a lot of standby moves relative to some of the others in Ontario, in Grey County, sorry, that's similar to what we've seen elsewhere in relatively rural services. In terms of addressing that, and I know that's something that staff have mentioned before, when we're looking to the future and adding more vehicles into the system, this will naturally reduce, because if you had a station that only has 1 vehicle, if it now has 2 vehicles in the future, if one of those vehicles is busy on an incident, there's still that other vehicle that's there, rather than having to necessarily move a vehicle to cover a station. We look at benchmarking to give an idea, really to identify where maybe Grey County could sit potentially as an outlier in terms of some of the measures compared to some other relatively rural and mixed services in Ontario, so excluding some of the more urban services we've worked with. The advantage to this is we undertake using the same methodology for each service, so we can compare services. I would say within this, we're not really seeing that Grey County are a clear outlier for any of the measures. Actually, in fact, the measure that you rank particularly well on is you have the shortest overall occupied time of any of these services that we've worked with. That's a bit of a combination with relatively short travel time to scene, time at scene, short time to hospital, and also not a significant challenge with offload delays compared to some of the other services you've worked with. So together, that means your average time spent on a job, on a response, is actually the lowest of any services we've worked with. Just showing a couple of the examples of things we tend to suggest, if possible, for testing out a reduction in where we think there is potentially some efficiency in other services. First one we usually look at is time at scene. So Grey County here is shown in the blue. You're actually right in the middle of all the different services we've worked with in here in terms of spending around 24 minutes time at scene on average. So not a significant, not an outlier in any sense. So not really looking to suggest that anything could be done under this measure, or that it would provide necessarily any efficiency in terms of the overall time. Likewise, when we look at time to hospital, which we've coloured in here, this part being the arrival to offload, so before offload, this part being offload to clear, so after offload. Grey County sitting there as the 3rd lowest we've worked with, and very much in this group here where offload or total time at hospital is under 22 minutes for all these services. As you can see, we work in other services where it is double that, and if we looked at more urban services, even more so. So hospital offload delays based on our sample data not presenting a huge challenge. However, we did note on that graph earlier on that things have increased over the last few years, so something to monitor for the future, but not necessarily presenting a problem at the moment. So just before I move on to the demand projection section, just wanted to pause now to take any questions or comments on those slides I've shown so far.
I can't see the folks online, so I'm not sure. Does anyone online have any questions at this point? There will be other opportunities. No? Oh, Councillor Nielsen, I see your hand. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Warden Milne. Just wondering, in terms of data collection, is any of what we're seeing today, is there data collected that was a call to like one of our rural hospitals transferring to one of our like Ottawa Sound? I'm thinking in my head that, at least coming from Grey Highlands, residents have a feeling that I can get myself to Markdale Hospital faster than the response time of an ambulance as the concern. So is data collection in terms of a need being taken from people who get themselves to Markdale Hospital, but then that person needs more urgent care that's required from Owen Sound, so we're transferring from Markdale to Owen Sound or perhaps other rural hospitals that exist within Grey County? Is any of that data being collected and analyzed during this collection?
Thank you, Councillor. Yep, great question. Yes, it is the short answer. So the data we actually collect is from a combination of ADRS and ACR data, and it's effectively each line in the data set is a patient or a response that a vehicle made. So it does and will include all of those types of responses you've just shown really, or just described really, where a patient comes from maybe a relatively rural hospital and then requires transfer to a more urban hospital, or maybe vice versa, to be kind of effectively repatriated. That's in our data set and also in our modeling as well, because you're right, there is maybe good access to the immediate hospital, but then there's a secondary transfer effectively to a larger hospital in some cases, and maybe that's out of county to London perhaps, for an example. So yes, that is captured.
Okay, not seeing any further questions now. Let's keep going, Andrew. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So now I'll just describe the kind of demand projection process too. So process we use, so at the moment, all the analysis we've talked about is all historical analysis, and that's very useful, but it doesn't really necessarily tell us that much about what the future might bring for Grey County Paramedic Service. So first thing we need to do is use a method to project demand for the future. How many patients are you going to be responding to effectively? To do that, we use, and it's something we've used in lots of reviews, we look at the historic age and gender profile for historic incidents. So for all the last 10 years or so of data we've got from Grey County, what's the age and gender of that patient if that's captured? We also have historical population data, so we know how many people are resident within a given municipality, for example, in a given year, in a given age and gender group. By combining those up, that gives us a rate of demand per head or per 1,000 people. And that may have changed by year, that may change by age gender group, that may change by municipality for various different reasons. We then forecast that through to 2033. So if there has been a general trend in, even per person, more calls for ambulance or paramedic service assistance per year, then we want to capture that trend through to 2033. So we forecast that through. We also have population projections through to 2033 to combine those up to get a demand forecast by municipality for 2033 and every year in between. I'd say there are three main factors to this population-based demand projection method. There's the total population change. So maybe in a given municipality, there's a reduction in population or an increase in population. That'll be different by area. There's generally an aging population that we find in Western countries. And maybe again, that differs. You'll have some areas where there tends to be a more elderly population or a younger population. And there tends to be an increasing demand rate per head. So even per person over the last 10 years or so, there's more and more chance that someone will require paramedic service assistance. Something that's very hard to quantify why that's being driven. Is that people are having more complex comorbidities? Is that maybe since the pandemic, a kind of buildup of conditions and things like that? Hard to understand. Not something you can necessarily get data on the why, but we can see it happening. So first one of those thinking about population. This just shows a population pyramid from the Hempson Consulting and Ministry of Finance figures. The bars on the left-hand side, the darker purple bars, these show males within 2021. This is just for the whole of Grey County, but we know it by municipality. And on the right-hand side, the lighter purple, females in 2021. Then the lines up here, again, males on the left, females on the right. These show the population in 2033. So how does that change effectively in the next 10 years or so? What we can see really is that this area here, the kind of 70 to 74 and through to 85 plus age group, the lines are a lot higher. There's more people in these groups than where the bars were. And that's this kind of bump here, I guess, shifting up as time passes on. People get older as time goes on. We can also see though some increases in movement, obviously, as people generally shift up the pyramid, but there is some kind of teenage year population increase also. And this is fairly typical, I would say, of some of the services we work in, both in Ontario and in the UK in particular. We also look at the demand rate per 1,000 people. So kind of ignoring how many people there are in each age group. Actually, if you calculate per 1,000 people in that age group, how many times do they need ambulance assistance per year? This graph is quite familiar to us. What it shows us is the projected demand rate change. And if I take the 75 plus age group as an example, in 2022, there were around 350 or so, I think 360 calls per 1,000 people per year, incidents per 1,000 people per year. But that's been increasing prior to 2022, and we're projecting that to increase to around 700 per 1,000 people. If you got to 1,000 per 1,000 people, that's every person effectively needing assistance once a year. And this is generally this group here, 75 plus age group, similarly 65 to 74 less stark. That tends to be the age group with the largest increase in demand rate. And as shown on the previous slide, there are more people now in that age group in the future, driving that demand rate increase. So again, something I would say fairly typical of other services we worked with in Ontario, and particularly more rural services in Ontario, and also some of the UK as well. We've also been thankfully provided with new development or growth area information from planning and GIS. Here we're just showing polygons on the map, effectively where are those, and the darker the blue, the more units that are projected to be built within the next 10 years in those areas. Really that Cobble Beach area in Georgian Bluffs standing out in particular, and around the kind of Blue Mountains Resort as two of the main areas where there are larger developments. This is great for us because although I've just shared in the previous slides, we can calculate things by municipality. This allows us to, within a municipality, effectively drill down to make sure we're capturing demand increases where we think there are going to be more people present in the future, rather than just blanket across the municipality. So what that produces in terms of demand projections for code 3 and code 4 incidents here, although we do capture the code 1s and code 2s, is we're projecting an average 5.8% increase over the next 10 years, which works out to be around a 68% increase in total over 10 years. This compares to around a 6.5% increase that we've seen on average for the last 10 years. But it does differ by municipality. So this is something I know there's been a question on, I think yesterday, around demand projections and how they're calculated, and some questions about the numbers included. So I would say that demand projections are a very difficult area, especially when you're thinking of the next 10 years to, I don't think any projection method would be perfect. we tend to use this method across a lot of our reviews, and we do work with clients in the future to, sense check, has the demand projection been in line with what's expected? But clearly, given things in the last few years in particular, we didn't really predict that kind of drop in demand associated with a global pandemic occurring in 2020 and 21. So there's a good example of where things can obviously change. And historical demand changes or population changes don't necessarily always equate to large demand changes in the future, because it depends, as I've just talked through, really, if there is a big development in an area, it depends what type of population might be moving into that area. If it's more elderly population, you maybe expect more calls per head than an area where there are younger populations or younger families, etc., moving in. I know there was a question particularly around Blue Mountains that has had some large historical increases, and on average around 19%, I thought, or just 18.5% over the last 10 years. We're projecting that still to be the highest increase of any of the municipalities, but it is lower at just under 9% per year. However, that is 8.7% there. That is 8.7% every single year through to 2033. So some years will be higher, some years will be lower, just as in the past, some years will have been lower. That 8.7% figure there is actually higher than 6 of the last 10 years in Blue Mountains. One of the years that did have a particularly high increase as well in Blue Mountains, there was, I think, about a 30% or 33% increase in call volumes in Blue Mountains, but that actually only equated to 1 incident more per day, relatively small numbers in terms of actual incidents. And ultimately, we're looking at how many incidents are needed to be responded with, and what does that mean for the resourcing requirements for an area. 1 incident a day more would not necessarily, unless we're right on that cusp of needing an extra crew, would not necessarily require an extra crew to put in place to respond to that call. And something I'll come on to later around this demand projection. So we have also tested out a lower demand projection and a higher demand projection, because we know any projection we come up with, although it's based on population and demographic figures, it may not ring true in every area, and things may be different. So one of the advantages of the modeling approach we take is we can relatively quickly test out, okay, what if that's not 5.8%? What if that's 7.8% every year? What does that mean for performance? What does that mean for getting to patients? What does that mean for how many crews that Grey County Paramedic Services needs? And then final point on that also, Grey County do actually have the copy of the modeling software we use as well. So if there are changes that occur in future, they're able to adapt to that, monitor those, test those out in the model, and see what that actually means in terms of what they need on the road and what performance will look like. I can see a hand up from a councillor online, so happy to take a question now, if that's okay.
Yeah, I saw Councillor Bordeniel's hand up. Go ahead, Peter.
If that's good with you, Mr. Warden, thank you through you to Andrew. Andrew, if you can go back to slide 23, just the previous slide before, and I'm trying to, and one more, sorry, 23.
Sorry,
and
sure.
They seem to contradict each other, and I'm trying to keep my Grey County hat on as opposed to my Blue Mountains hat on. I can't see over 50% decrease when it's spelled out in the color modeling here for the Blue Mountains area. Slide 24 seems to totally contradict slide 23. Blue Mountains is the second fastest growing municipality in Canada. So how, in any stretch of the imagination, can we justify a decrease? I understood what you said about the previous 10 years, about the number of years in there that were decreased, but we know what our projections are. We know what planning is. We know what our modeling is for planning. And we also know that our average age is around 64 years old. So, and we have different retirement areas within those. So I can't, from a math point of view, I can't reconcile your numbers.
Thank you, Councillor. So we're not projecting a decrease in demand at any point in any of the municipalities. All of the municipalities have projected an increase in demand. So I'm not quite sure. You said about a 50% decrease.
Well, 18.6% to 8.7%.
That's the average annual change. So 8.7% means every single year there's 8.7% more incidents occurring than the previous year, and it's stacked on top. That's every single year. So at no point does demand go down. We're projecting that it will go up, and that figure is higher than 6 of the last 10 years for Blue Mountains in particular.
But we
So
know that through you, Mr. Warden, we know that through planning, that they will be. So I think your number is very, very low there. I understand it's year over year and it's increasing 8.7, but that's not, if you extrapolate that over the 2022 to 2033, I'd like to see that percentage as well, so we can have to take a good look at what that will actually look like by the time we hit 2033.
Sure, thank you. I think, sorry.
Oh, I was wondering if our local chief, Kevin, do you want to chime in on that, or?
Yeah, just in speaking with Andrew, like what he's saying here is each year it'll be 8.7 plus 8.7 plus 8.7. And also with the modeling, how it doesn't always extrapolate out, because of increase in population, the increase in calls are going to come up. He'd be more apt to answer that more better than I could, but yeah, I think that's.
Yeah, I'm Kim, do you want to go ahead?
I hear what you're saying, Councillor Bourdignon, that your concern is that if the growth in call volume annually in the previous 10 years, that 18.6, however, as Andrew pointed out, the 8.7 is actually higher than 6 of those years, if I'm quoting you properly, Andrew. You mentioned, Andrew, that there were a couple of times in those previous years where there was a significant increase in one year. I'm not sure that we know exactly what happened in that year that caused that increase. Maybe that was the year we opened the snowboard hill or something, but when you're working with averages, if you have one year that's a real outlier, it can badly skew, I think, what the average is. Is that a little bit of what might have happened here?
Go ahead, Andrew.
Sure, thank you. Yes, so that is part of it as well. So there were, as I said, 6 years out of 10 that have a lower increase than 8.7%. I think 3 of them are around or below 3% per year in the Blue Mountains. But there is a year, I can't remember which year it was now, 15 to 16, possibly into 2016, where call volumes increased by 33%. That will, as you said, Kim, that will skew that average. So that average now is 18% because of 1 or 2 relatively high years, which will occur statistically over time. And we're trying to take the average here, but also provide through some of the sensitivity modeling we've done higher figures and lower figures so that you can understand how those differences play out in terms of demand. With that year where the increase was 33%, that was only 1 extra incident per day. So it's important to, although in percentage terms things look large, it may be a fraction of an incident per day. Obviously that adds up, particularly over 10 years. And I think my math is correct. Over 10 years, we're projecting for Blue Mountains, there will be more than a doubling of calls per day that occur in Blue Mountains. So by no means are we, saying there's not going to be a significant increase. Clearly, it could be more significant. It could be less significant. I think given the sensitivity modeling we've done and given the fact that we're handing over the model itself to Grey County Paramedic Services, that's something you can be monitoring and also testing out on the model and then adjusting if necessary to make sure that you respond to those increases as they may be different.
Just I want to stay with Councillor Bourdignon just for while we'll go through this particular incident or issue. Councillor Bourdignon, are you satisfied, or do you have more questions?
Just one quick follow-up. I understand the percentages, the projection modeling. If you go to slide 23, it's spelled out the amount that will be there. So I'm just having a hard time reconciling page 23 and 24 together. You know, I'm fairly good at math, fairly good at percentages and modeling. I'm having a hard time when you look at this in its totality, spread across from west to east in the Blue Mountains community. You have 2 to 3 areas with 1,000 to 4,000 units. So I don't see that reflected as prominently as it should be maybe in slide 24. So that's just my comments. Thank you, Mr. Warden.
Thank you, Councillor Bordignon. And Andrew, do you have anything further there or?
Yes, I think that's a good point. Thank you, Councillor, for your question again. So I think what it can show here is that whilst this is the total volume of new development areas, there's also obviously the underlying change in demographics, population, aging, and requests for ambulance assistance that we kind of showed in the previous slide. So it's not always necessarily about the new development areas, although they are clearly significant in the Blue Mountains. There's also that general change in population that does occur kind of underneath that. And when we use this projection method and build the developments into an area, we look at the average demand rate per head for people in Blue Mountains, for example, which might be different to some of the other areas. So it could be a case that the average demand rate per head in Blue Mountains is relatively lower than some of the other areas. Therefore, you build a development in Blue Mountains, it's slightly different to some of the other areas. There is also the point, though, I came onto previously around the winter demand being clearly quite different to kind of the more off-peak demand, which I think is something that we're definitely aware of. Within the modelling itself, we did test out some off-peak and peak modelling, particularly in Blue Mountains, because there is such a difference. So it could be that some of that also might mask the over. Again, it's a question of kind of averages, but there will be extremes within that, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. Councillor Nielsen, you had a question.
Thank you very much, Warden Milne. Just a question being new to the seat here, wondering the review timeline. So we're looking at a 10-year comprehensive plan. Is the general plan of Grey County to re-review this plan after 5 years as part of kind of phase one of my question? Second would be, if, you know, during the review, how is that going to be able to affect and pivot our phase-in timelines here? 2033, there is a recommendation to have a 12-hour shift added to the Craigleith area. Given the conversation coming from our council members from the town of Blue Mountains, just wondering, review process, ability to pivot some of the phase-in timelines.
A response report, a response time report comes to council every March, every year, but I'll let Kevin speak more to that.
Yeah, so each year we report on last year's response time. So in March, I'll be coming forward with the response times from 2022. I give the county response times, but also break it out by municipality. So we have a chance to review it there. And then each August, we bring forward recommendations to council for consideration for the next year's response time plan. So those are both at least twice a year where we give those considerations. In the report itself, it does speak to, and it actually identifies Blue Mountains as an area. And we don't just look at one area, we look at all areas all the time. Like I can see it a couple clicks of a button of how different municipalities are doing, how the county's doing as a whole. So we monitor that all the time. But it does make recommendations there or remarks in the report that Blue Mountain is an area for us to keep an eye on. And that if we have to adjust based upon increased call volumes, that we would look to those areas to improve that response time.
Okay, Councillor McQueen.
Thank you, Mr. Warden, and to the presenter. So it talks about changes of social aging and demands. Question I have is, again, a bit more back to the Blue Mountains, but you know, the Southern Georgian Bay area. There's a few things that we saw changed. I know in Grey Highlands, over 1,200 residents or seasonal residents during COVID. A lot of those seasonal residents became permanent, and for a period of time, and I think maybe more so in Blue Mountains, it became permanent. So my question is, did you capture that? And as the population gets older, there's probably more of a tendency that they will be permanent here because that's their seasonal becomes their permanent residence, as long as there's a support that's the services to support that. That's one. The other thing is, I understand from a planning perspective, there is a perspective of more of the resort type development, hotels, and it was talked about in the past year in that area as well. And has that been teased out or the perspective of that? Because that changes your permanent or seasonal residents or people coming, but that's also just people being in the area, as we know. And as you create more resort, more hotels, more recreational opportunities, that changes the population and demands, because somehow people come here to visit and they get hurt. So I'll leave those 2 points in the sense of becoming more permanent residents, because I think the population of Blue, and I look at my colleagues there, or maybe staff, is what, 7,500 or whatever that permanent population is, but it fluctuates so much, right? So, and then, and then I guess I go back to the part of the Southern Georgian Bay region, to not just Blue, but Grey Highlands and Meaford as well, is seeing those uptakes as well as that new influx of that area as an area. Yourself added to that is like how yourself Southgate is growing, and it's growing in a different way. But I'll leave that for maybe you to ask that question. But so those are the 2 points with regards to seasonal and with regards to resort development.
Thank you, Councillor McQueen. Andrew, do you want to take a run at that?
Great, thank you. Good questions, Councillor. Yes, so firstly on the kind of seasonal population change, definitely something we're aware of, that maybe second homes became permanent homes during that period in particular, and there's a relative level of permanency, if that's the right word, maybe temporary permanent, I don't know. That should be captured within the population, historical population figures that we've got effectively built into this modelling. Clearly that could change going forward in the future, so I think something that should be monitored is, again, that particularly in Blue Mountains, call volume, but also population levels too. Then in terms of the resort kind of areas, I can't remember off the top of my head the exact development areas included within the Blue Mountains. It's always difficult to, with housing and population, and definitely permanent population, it's more straightforward to quantify what that means in terms of demand, because there are lots of other populations around. Blue Mountains Resort itself is obviously quite unique. So I think the general growth in usage of that resort should be captured within our demand modeling. I have to go back and check the actual development files we received to see whether there are any specific kind of hotel type developments included, but we definitely see that in that seasonal difference that I talked about earlier, that there are, definite differences in people using the resort, not necessarily residents, that then drive ambulance service demand.
I see Randy has his hand up back there. Maybe he'd like to add something.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Warden. And further to what Andrew indicated earlier, one of the nice things Grey County is going to have is access to some of the modeling abilities that Andrew and his team have brought to this table. And so we'll be able to, as we update our growth forecast, as we have new developments and others come online, as we monitor those in terms of the build out of those developments, we'll be able to update that information through that modeling and monitor it and track it over time. So I think that's one of the huge benefits, I think, for sure, coming out of this, is that we'll be able to track this. And as we come forward with then annual budgets and capital plans and other things, we'll be able to use the latest and greatest data and information that we have to be able to support some of those recommendations and ultimate decisions that council will make.
Excellent. Thank you, Randy. Councillor DeBreen, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
Thank you, Warden Milne and Drew. I would be remiss not to chime in with regard to Southgate, specifically Dundalk's growth projections. The one of the projections that I found very interesting was that the population of Southgate being about 8,300, Dundalk in the next 10 to 15 years could actually surpass that total population number in itself with all of its urban expansion. So I too had concerns about the percentages, and I think you've explained it, but I would like to see that a little bit better explained. I'm grateful for Randy Scherzer's comment that they're going to be monitoring this data as subdivisions come online. And as we know, our growth projections are going to double, and that there'll be the ability to pivot should the demand change in any particular area throughout Grey County. I know that currently our families, the families that are moving into the area are intergenerational. So not only are we having children and teenagers moving into Dundalk, but so are their parents and grandparents sharing that space. So it may not be captured appropriately or as well as we might like. So thank you to Councillor Bordenau for raising the flag about the percentages, because I too had that concern. I'll leave it more of a comment, Warren, but definitely something that we need to monitor.
Thank you, Councillor DeBreen. Councillor Bordenau, your hands up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know we need to move on, Mr. Warden, but through you, a very quick question for Andrew. Councillor McQueen brought it up as well. You know, we take 50% seasonal, 50% permanent. That's say we move to 2/3 permanent. Where is the accounting for 2.5 million visitors to the Blue Mountains, the whole Georgian Bay, South Georgian Bay area, but particularly we literally see 2.5 million people. So we can have a 30,000 population on a busy weekend. All the permits are here, all the seasonals are here, and another 10 to 15,000 visitors. How are the tourists who may need this type of service accounted for?
Go ahead, Andrew.
Great, thank you. So if I answer just or counter kind of Councillor DeBreen's point first, so I think what I might be able to, I have to think about the exact format, but I might be able to provide something kind of separately that will help allay concerns around population to growth and what that means in particular areas. So something I can do offline, but leave that with me if that's okay. And then Councillor Bordenau, thank you for your question there. So how the visitors are captured is effectively within our data, they are driving the demand that we've seen historically within Blue Mountains. So if we were to open the model itself, we would see a large amount of demand occurring within the resort effectively that is driven by those visitors. So although they're not necessarily captured in the population data because they're not resident, they are captured within the actual demand data itself. And then when we project forward, we're effectively taking account what they've done historically and how that might change in the future, if that makes sense. So they're definitely incorporated within there. We just don't get population information about them, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Andrew. Councillor Mackey, you're good? Okay, he's going to defer his question until later. So, Councillor Gregg.
Thanks, Warden Milne. I'll just quickly mention, I'm happy with the material, the data sets as presented. When we're talking about development on slide 24 and how it relates to the next slide, a lot of this growth, I mean, this is a 10-year projection. A lot of this growth that's occurring in Dundalk is relative to age group demographics, which fall much earlier on in the demand rates per thousand people, which is slide 22. So we're comparing code 3 and code 4 call volumes, and those earlier age groups are not the age groups that you apply code 3 and code 4 call volumes to the same extent. So to this point, I'm quite happy with the data set as provided. Thanks.
Very good. So not seeing any further questions for now, Andrew, I'll encourage you to keep going.
Yep, great, thank you. So I will pick up the pace a little bit if that's okay. And I had scheduled another break for questions. I think I'll leave until the end where we can do more questions just in interest of time. So I want to talk a little bit about the modeling process. So far we talked about analysis and demand projections. Now, how do we understand what the call volumes will look like in future and what that means for performance, response performance, and staff and vehicles. Firstly, why do we model? So really, this is a list of why we model. It's a way to replicate what is a very complex system. There's a lot of things occurring in any paramedic service at any one time. It's not something we can come up with a simple formula for. We need to simulate that service. Also means we can test things in a safe environment, so we can test out higher demand increases or larger developments in Blue Mountains, for example, within the model. And that doesn't need to be something that we have to wait to see happen to then deal with, if that makes sense. Likewise, we could test out a new base somewhere and see what that does for performance and resourcing. We can identify optimum solutions, but also compare them to feasible options, because we want to suggest things that are obviously deliverable. We can also test out how multiple factors interact with each other. So maybe demand increases, but offload delay increases as well at the same time, but understanding which one is driving the change in performance. And it gives us this evidence base for consultation like today. This is our model of Grey County as it sits. So this is AMSIM, and it's kind of personalized effectively for each service we work in, and it's built with analysis of Grey County like that we've just talked about effectively. So it's built with the location of demand pretty much on a map from where they occur. It's built with the resources that you're expected to put out in terms of ambulance shift timings, things like that. And everything effectively that we analyze goes into our model so that we can first set it up to be a replica and then use it to test options for change in the future. In terms of that replication or model calibration, as we call it, these are just a couple of example graphs that show generally the model itself in the blue lines and blue bars showing a close match to the red lines, which is the analysis that we've presented and looked at. It will never be perfect. It is a simulation model running on a computer, and we can't get data on absolutely everything, and we can't necessarily understand absolutely everything, but we get a close match, and we know from our experience what a close match should look like, and therefore are confident we can use it in the future to test out some of the options. So what we've done in terms of the different modeling scenarios, so using current demand levels, so before we think about any growth, where would your optimal locations be across Grey County? We then looked at relocating the first response unit, the FRU. We looked at adding multiple vehicles to each station to understand, is there a capacity challenge in terms of the number of vehicles or a coverage challenge in terms of where stations are? We then looked all the way through to 2033 to understand if nothing happened other than demand increased, what would that do to performance? And then we've looked at maintaining the current level of performance within each municipality through to 2033. In sensitivity modeling at the bottom left, we've tested out different alternative future demand levels. So again, if we're concerned that perhaps demand in an area is not high enough or too high, testing out what if that demand increase is higher or lower? What does that mean for the bottom line in terms of performance and therefore resources on the road? What does that mean for patients? Also tested out changes to offload delays. And then ultimately, we've come up with a phasing that we kind of talked through at the start in terms of adding in resources to maintain performance. Majority of performance figures and reporting focuses on priority 4 code for emergency calls. We're showing generally 8 minutes and also 15 minutes. 8 minutes is quite appropriate for your more urban areas, 15 minutes more so for the more rural areas, and we want to show a balance and understand the difference between the two. And historically, Grey County paramedic services have been around 90% within 15 minutes for CTAS 2. So we've looked at the 90th percentile and seen where that sits. Is that close to 15 minutes? Just briefly going to show a map here. This effectively shows us where the optimal sites across Grey County would be compared to where the current sites are in grey. So this is a really good result. So based on where all your patients are, and we tested this both with Grey County responded demand, all Grey County demand, regardless of who responded, so maybe Simcoe coming in as an example, and also including the new development information we were provided with. And we get a very similar result for each of those scenarios. And with one exception I'll come on to, all of the stations actually show they're very close to where the optimal site would be. So not really suggesting any of your bases need to necessarily move for location reasons, which is a great result. This move here highlighted, the model did suggest potentially testing out moving Chatsworth to Thornbury, something we tried out. It's very negligible in terms of performance. In some cases shows a slight degradation in performance. So actually things get slightly worse overall across Grey County, clearly better in Thornbury, worse in Chatsworth. Not something we'd suggest doing. You know, there's not a great benefit to doing it. So why would you move a station there? But something we wanted to test out. Tested out relocating the FRU, first response unit, and thanks to Kevin providing a photo of what it looks like. Currently, it is based at Markdale and provides coverage in the south of the county. We've tested out moving it to each base or standby post and then becoming a dedicated response vehicle. So not really providing standby coverage, but instead a primary response from that station. The largest improvements are in really the kind of more urban areas. Owen Sound, Thornbury is an example where you currently don't have a permanent base. So moving something there might provide some benefit, and also Chatsworth. There are negative performance impacts for Dundalk, Flesherton, Kimberley, Markdale, or Meaford. I would say, though, that all of these options show relatively small change. Nothing is huge in terms of percentage improvements or reductions. So we've looked at actually upstaffing this to a transport-capable ambulance unit, because the majority of patients you respond to, you do then transport to hospital, and incorporating that into a Feversham station in the future, but something we wanted to test out here. We've also tried adding vehicles with current demand, adding 1, 2, or 3 24/7 vehicles to each station to see what improvements do we get. The largest improvement is in Owen Sound, similar, followed by Chatsworth. The smallest improvement would be adding into Markdale. So what this is telling us is Owen Sound is, the busiest area in terms of call volumes in quite a tight urban area. If you could add a vehicle there, you would get the largest improvement in 90th percentile, because if there are 2 simultaneous calls, for example, you've got another crew, or 3 in the daytime, as there's already 2. If you add another crew there, you've got an extra vehicle to deal with that call, but you're still responding from the same base. Markdale, as an example, doesn't really improve Grey County-wide performance much, and even not that much within Grey Highlands. That's because it's more of a location challenge and a coverage and drive time challenge in that relatively rural area, rather than needing more vehicles at the existing base. Hence, we've looked at Feversham in that case. Even if we had 3 vehicles into Markdale, 3 24/7 additional vehicles into Markdale, we still aren't gaining a huge improvement. It's under a minute improvement in the 90th percentile in Grey Highlands. Much larger in other areas if we were to look at those. So this kind of shows us the limit of what you can do with existing stations in terms of improving performance, and where there might be coverage challenges. We also looked, so in 2022, or the year to date in 2022, at that point, Grey County, across Grey County, wasn't quite meeting the 90th percentile 15-minute standard. It was about 87.5%. So we looked at how many resources would need to be added in to make sure we meet that position effectively right now. You'd need an additional 2 12-hour day shifts in Owen Sound and 1 additional day shift at Craigleith to bring performance up. There would still be areas that don't meet that 90th percentile 15-minute standard, but it would be met across Grey County. Moving the FRU to Kimberley would help improve Grey Highland in particular to be under 20 minutes, and that's the area with the lowest 15-minute priority 4 or code 4 performance. This scenario, the top right table here, shows us what performance would look like in 2033 if we build in that demand projection of 5.8% per year and differing for different areas. This shows us what the impact would be in the future. That 8-minute performance mark here shows, or is aligned to, a fall in CTAS-1 and sudden cardiac arrest performance. So we'd be under 50% in 8 minutes in 2033 if we just added demand in and didn't add any resources in. Not something we're suggesting as a recommendation, but it's important to understand as a point of, if we stay where we are now but demand keeps growing, what happens? This is the answer. ambulance utilization would double. So we'd be around 36% utilized, excluding drives back to the station. Some of the largest impacts are aligned to where there are larger increases in demand, Owen Sound, but also Blue Mountains having one of the larger impacts in terms of the 90th percentile. Our 90th percentile now over 23 minutes in this scenario. Important to also note when we look at this by 2-year batches effectively, you can see if we focus on this dotted line here, which is the overall across Grey County, it's not a straight line, it kind of curves up towards the end, as do all the other lines. That's showing us that as demand builds up more and more, it's a kind of not exponential curve, but a larger degradation in performance, a larger worsening of the 90th percentile for these different areas and indeed overall. So it's not always a straightforward case of this much more demand means this much more worse performance, because it depends where you're starting from, and as you go into the future, things get worse quicker. So yeah, 10% of patients would wait longer than 23.5 minutes in 2033 across Grey County, if nothing was changed in terms of resourcing. We've then looked at what that resourcing change might need to look like. So if we wish to maintain the current level of performance in 2033, so maintaining the kind of 2022 performance through to 2033, we'd need an additional 672 ambulance hours a week, which is around a 32% increase in resourcing. But demand is increasing by around 68% in those 10 years. So it's not always a one-to-one relationship between demand and resources. Because we're trying to maintain this for each municipality, we actually get an improvement in performance across Grey County. And in fact, if you look at how many of these are green, this shows the difference to where we are now, with the exception of Georgian Bluffs, where we have that Cobble Beach demand growing outside of the current Owen Sound station catchment effectively. With the exception of Georgian Bluffs, everywhere gets an improvement in performance, and for the variety of measures shown here and differing by each area. So we're actually improving performance in this scenario. It's often a case of either we add an additional vehicle, improve performance, or we don't add an additional vehicle and have worse performance than current. So we've gone with the first approach of generally improving by municipality. This does also include the current first response unit that we showed a picture of, upstaffing that into an ambulance as well. We're not, though, then meeting the 90th percentile of 15-minute standard that we've talked about a couple of times. But if we added a 12-hour shift at Feversham on top of that, this would get us to under 15 minutes across Grey County, and it would reduce the Grey Highlands 90th percentile to 19 minutes, and that's the longer time. So 10% of patients would wait longer than 19 minutes now in Grey Highlands, better than current. There will also clearly, as we add resources in time, be capacity constraints. There are constraints around where vehicles are stored at the moment, and particularly with spare vehicles, some relocations may be required, and community paramedicine vehicles too. So within the full report, we've kind of identified potentially where some changes might need to occur. We've also then undertaken some sensitivity modeling. So we've had quite a lot of discussion around demand projections. It's important to stress test that, because no figure, it's difficult to come up with a single figure that you think that is going to be exactly it and it will never change. So we've modeled a lower demand increase per year of 3.8% per year and a higher demand increase per year of 7.8% per year, differing by municipality, to show what that would mean for performance if nothing occurred other than demand grew, and what that would mean in terms of the crews that we need to add to make sure we maintain performance. We've also tested out a reduction in offload delays to see effectively how much does that already cost Grey County paramedic services since before COVID versus what might happen if that trend continues in terms of increasing offload delays. Like I said, not presenting a current challenge, but maybe more so in the future. So this just shows a few of the results in terms of the sensitivity modeling. Appreciate quite a lot of numbers on the screen here. But if nothing were to occur other than demand increasing, and we go with the higher demand increase, we're now actually below 40% 8-minute code 4 performance, and only around 2/3 of calls would be responded to in 15 minutes. So quite a lot different to where we are currently. If we wanted to maintain current performance, but with this higher demand increase of 7.8%, we would need an additional 1,000 ambulance hours a week, approximately, rather than the 670 that we showed in previous slides and is shown here. So with a 7.8% increase in demand, in total, that's more than a doubling of demand in 10 years. It's a 106% increase. And that's around a 48% increase in resourcing, that 1,000-hour figure there. On the offload delay figures, we'd be able to reduce that 672 number to 588 if offload delays were as they were before COVID-19. So not a huge change, but still notable. If things increased at the rate they have been increasing so far, we would need 840 hours a week rather than 672. So I think this highlights where, particularly as Grey County have the model and are able to test out some of these things effectively internally and update demand projection figures, update offload delays potentially. This kind of gives a flavor of the changes that might occur if some of these came true. There are many possibilities of things you could test within the model. So we could test out that Blue Mountains demand increase being the same as it has been historically. What does that mean? When does that mean the Craigleith crew needs to be introduced to maintain performance? You would assume sooner. Then I'll just quickly go through the phasing before we hopefully have some time for questions. I think we've run on a little longer than the hour. This just shows the priority for 8-minute performance, and I'll show 15-minute performance in a second. In the red line here, we're trying to maintain it at around this kind of 2022 level. And in fact, we are improving it. This shows how many additional ambulance hours we would have effectively each year. And that aligns to the earlier slides I showed around the recommendations, where we're adding a day shift. That's 12 hours a day, 7 days a week is that 84 there. Into Owen Sound and also into Hanover. So you can see how these kind of build up in our recommendations effectively. Recognizing that the 2023 submissions for funding have obviously already been made, where we say 2023 here, we're recommending them for 2024. In terms of performance, what that means, with the exception of the first year where we're kind of trying to get things back up to speed without, we can't add a fraction of a shift into each station. We have to work in whole shifts. Generally, a lot of these numbers here are shaded in green, which means an improvement compared to where you currently are, both for the 8-minute performance here, but also the 15-minute performance at the bottom table. Georgian Bluffs does present a challenge in terms of where the demand is growing in that area in particular. But particularly for that 15-minute measure, Georgian Bluffs relatively high performing compared to some of the other municipalities to start with. I'll then just briefly cover with much more detail in the full report, the support services and organizational structure. So we did subcontract ACE to review these elements. Their expertise very much lies in that side of the work, effectively with running ambulance services. This covered a review of the leadership and strategic direction, operational structure and the clinical response model. Also looked at frontline and potentially that clinical supervision layer that could be introduced. Also looked at the support services provided to the paramedic services, partly by the county and other parties. And the full outcomes of this and kind of description of the process are included in the draft final report. So appreciate I ran through that last action there quite quickly in terms of trying to get back on track in terms of time, but I'm happy to take any further questions now.
Thank you, Andrew. Councillor McKay. Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. And through you to Andrew, thanks very much for all the information and for validating the fact that Georgian Bluff has been causing trouble for a long time. I guess my question goes back to the map. I think it's on page 14. It looks like a weather map, but it has all the red in it. That is over the 15-minute response times. Most of those red areas extend into neighboring municipal, sorry, neighboring counties. I'm just wondering what conversations have occurred with Bruce, Simcoe, Dufferin and Wellington likely, because that response time is going to be an issue for those counties also. So I'm just wondering how we're working together regionally to try and limit and reduce. I heard mention about putting a station in Feversham. Just wondering, did they look at well, what's the other little town over there? Singhampton, as opposed that would help out both Simcoe and Grey County. So that's my question, is just how we're coordinating this on a regional level with the other services. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Mackey. Kevin, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so when we look at this, mostly we look at code 3 and code 4 calls, but we particularly look at code 4 calls. That's the one where we want the 8-minute and the 15-minute response time. As far as the province is concerned, for code 4 calls, they're seamless. So as far as if a call's dispatched, the closest vehicle will go. So if the call's on the borderline, then they'll be looking at a ratio of 5 kilometers on either side of the border to see if a vehicle is in that range. There is a new program with dispatch called CAD 5. Right now, London cannot see Georgian's vehicles, but this year they will be able to see where those vehicles are. So it may help with some of that. As far as coordinating bases and stuff like that, as far as like putting one base and both services paying for it, we've never went down that road. It's not something that we couldn't look at. One thing that happens though, especially in these larger areas, they'll pull those vehicles in to cover their busiest areas. So if we have a vehicle that's sitting in a bordering area and Barrie gets busy and we see it now, we're being pulled over to that direction to help cover off them at times. So those are kind of things we have to think about. If we don't have control of that vehicle, it may end up moving. So when we put a vehicle in Feversham, like we'll still help them out, we'll still cover them. But and the same with us, they're not coming our way, we're not going theirs, those type of things. But if we're closest, we'll go.
Thank you, Kevin. Oh, Councillor McKay, question.
Yeah, just to confirm that too, I know areas in Kitchener, London, Toronto, you take a transfer down to those cities. They'll nab you down there to do calls. You could spend your whole 12-hour shift running calls in London before they'll free you up. And Kitchener was really a bad one too at that time. So, I would just wonder if Kevin's ever talked to those dispatch centers down there and say, look, we're short staffed up here in Grey County. Try not to utilize us too much down in these cities.
As far as a code 4 call goes, when a vehicle's on shift, the vehicle needs to go. So if a closest unit for a code 4 call needs to respond, we've just recently actually put some things in place around vehicles that have already worked their 12 hours and that they're coming off of their shift, that the vehicles, and this will be soon, they respond to what we call an OIT, an obvious immediate threat. So that would be like a choking, cardiac arrest, respiratory arrest, but they wouldn't just go to any code 4 if they've already finished their shift. So code 4s, when they're on shift, as far as legislation goes, we can't not send a vehicle if they're the closest. We do have parameters and we're just actually beefing up our deployment around code 3 responses because we can put those parameters in place that, for code 3 response, unless they're delayed over an hour dispatching a unit to it, that we will not use our units to respond to those calls because we need them in our community, just like we won't leave our community for those calls. The only place that we don't do that is because everybody's kind of done it to us. We're kind of one of the last people not to do this, but Bruce County and us, we do have that reciprocal. We do have that long border and the same dispatch. So we do not have that. So we actually work back and forth quite closely with Bruce because of those reasons.
Any other questions on the report or the presentation rather? Okay, Councillor McQueen, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Not to belabor it, but another sector that I just wondered is being captured is our rural areas have become they're becoming rejuvenated. The farms, the shops, it's becoming more population in rural areas, and I'm sure your numbers are capturing that as well. So every year you have a report, but I just wondered if that's being captured, because we see that in Southgate, Grey Highlands, a little bit in Chatsworth. I think it's even moving into Meaford. You know, it's a trend that's coming. We've seen it. It's been happening for the last 20 years, and bigger families, but also bringing small commercial as well, which creates more individuals, more people. And it's something, you know, that should be noted, but it's something that probably through StatsCan or something. And I'm sure a lot of this is captured through when the statistics goes out and you capture those latest data and stuff like that. But it's just another trend that we have seen that should be just made note of anyway.
I think it's, as Andrew has shown, there's a tremendous amount of data has been analyzed through this whole exercise. And with the caveat that it can change year to year, if not more regular. So, and Kevin has a lot. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, that's one thing. Andrew speaks of the changes through COVID, because we've seen some pretty interesting things through COVID around call volumes. And typically when ORH does these present or evaluations, they look at 5 years worth of data. They actually went back to 2012. They went back further just to make sure they did get it right, because they wanted to look even further back to make sure some of these anomalies were covered. So hopefully that will even make it more accurate. Maybe Andrew, you can speak to that, but that's something you did once you started looking at the data, is that we're going to go back further just to ensure we got it right.
Do you want to add anything to that, Andrew?
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you, Councillor, for the question. Yes, that's as Kevin said there. Really, that's why we went back further, is to kind of get those overall underlying trends, make sure we're capturing that, given how much of the last 5 years has been obviously quite different.
Okay. Well, I think we've pretty well had a good chat about that, and there will be more information as time goes on, I'm sure, and the final report will come forward. So with that, I'm going to thank Andrew very much for your presentation. It was extremely thorough, and yeah, we went over time a little bit, but that's okay too. We need to understand it. So thank you very much, sir, and we'll talk again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
We need a vote to no. Okay. So I need a mover and a seconder for Kevin's report related to the presentation. Councillor Nielsen, Councillor McKay. Go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, so now I'm between you and lunch most likely, and I do have 4 pages here of speaking, so I'll try to move through it as quickly as I can. So thank you for allowing us to present today. So the recommendations from the report is that the report PSR CWO 223 regarding paramedic service comprehensive deployment review be received, and the county council supports the recommendations in principle outlined in the paramedic service comprehensive deployment review, and that staff be directed to bring forward recommendations as detailed in the comprehensive deployment review during annual budget deliberations for county council consideration. So for us, the paramedic services comprehensive deployment review from 2023 to 2033 was completed to ensure our paramedic services can meet the county's growing demand and keep the current service level up to 2033. This is really the first time that we've ever done this. It's an evidence-based, and it's really going to help us with planning as we go into the future. After discussions with county council in 2021, when we were bringing back the response time plan, we talked about, where do we go from here? What do we do? And it was brought forward at that time that we would, for budget considerations in 2022, we would request that this work could be done. So work was approved in the 22 budget, and it was included. When it was approved, we worked with ORH. It was selected through an RFP process. They have extensive knowledge in this work. You heard from Andrew, they work in the UK, but they also have significant amount of work in Ontario, and they have worked with their neighbors, Bruce County, Simcoe County, Wellington County, and Huron County, a number of different places throughout Ontario, and also repeats. So like services go back to them after they've done the first review. So that the work that they've done has been solid. Part of this work, there was a deployment committee. It wasn't just more or less ourselves and and ORH. We had the CAO, the deputy CAO, all of our management team. We had paramedic reps. We had a staff consultation. We had our dispatch center, communications rep, finance, planning, and GIS. So it was quite a committee that worked together on this, working together. So for our current state, ORH, you can see in that report that we benchmarked well against other services that are similar to us. And we're not really a particular outlier in any measure. And sometimes they come in and say, you need to switch this shift, or you need to change that, or you need to put more on nights or days or those type of things, but there really wasn't much to change. There is something for us to look at for the FRU, the first response unit, where it should go. We actually had it in One Sound, but what was happening is they would go to One Sound would go to Chatsworth would go to Markdale would go to Dundalk. We had all these units moving to cover Dundalk when Dundalk had a call. So what we found was it's easier to put it in Markdale because they can go both ways, and you save this cascade of vehicles traveling down the road. And when you look at what ORH brought forward, there's kind of negligible what the difference would be. I think we might probably keep it there until if we get approval to move to Feversham. But again, particularly not an outlier in any area. And the other thing and Andrew said this too, is that our bases are in the right area. It's not as if they say, well, that base is totally in the wrong area. You know, we talked initially about the Thornbury versus Chatsworth, and you know, what you gain in Thornbury, you'll lose in the county perspective. So they're really at this time not recommending to do that. So as far as where we're at right now, as far as meeting response times, when they looked at the last 5 years, we are meeting at a county-wide level when you look at the county across as a whole. But there are outliers, like look at Chatsworth and Grey Highlands. When we develop the response time standards, we don't develop them by lower tier municipality, we develop them by the county. So when we report on those, we develop by the county and we report on them there. But again, we still need to take a look at those areas of the lower tier municipalities to ensure we're doing the best we can for response times. Annually, our response times since 2016, we haven't met, I think only once where we've met the CTAS 2 requirement. We've been slightly under 89, point something, 88. But there will be a report coming in March. 2022 was our busiest year yet, and we did slip into the 87.93 for CTAS 2 in 15 minutes. This was noticed in our service review that was last year, and it was one of the recommendations was for us to look at this, and we haven't got the draft report on that, but we will be coming back to speak about that once we get that draft report from those results. I know it's between lunch, but I wanted to give a bit of history of how we got to where we are today and kind of what we've done, because I think it's important to look at what we've done since we assumed the service in 2004. We really worked hard to adjust to the growing demand for responses since 2004. When we first started, there was 12 ambulances on days and 5 on nights. And I remember I've been here that long, and that for transfers, they would commit 7 vehicles for transfers and keep 5 for emergencies. We corrected that almost right away to where, like we were heavily into the transfer business. A lot of our calls were transfers, but we switched that up that 7 vehicles would be for emergencies and 5 for transfers. And that ultimately ended up not performing well in transfer side of things, but we're still trying to protect those emergency calls. And I still remember at the time, we were under what they call the 1996 90th percentile, which was, they took the 90th percentile in 1996, which was 1554. And at that time we were 17 minutes with significantly less code 4 calls. But we had to do something to address those increasing response times. Just to give you an example, I can only go back 15 years on ADRS, but at that time in 2007, we're doing 10,678 calls, but 38% of those were transfers. And we're doing roughly for code 4 calls, we were doing 4,423. I'll come back to that in a minute when we get to where we are today. But through the years, again, we kind of like tending the fire. We've been just kind of building on and keeping on top of the trends that we were seeing. In 2011 and leading up to that, we had quite a bit of considerable issues on weekends in the Blue Mountain. So that's where we added an upstaff car on the weekends and on holidays. That I'm not 100% sure in the hours, but it's pretty much every weekend from Christmas holidays till March. We have an extra vehicle on Saturday, Sundays, and we also are there through Christmas break and March break and Family Day. In 2012, which was a big shift for us, we actually further came out of doing transfers and actually really focused on doing emergency calls. And we transitioned to where our priority was mostly emergency calls only, code 3 and code 4. And what we did is over the next number of years, we used those 8-hour ambulances from having 12. 3 of those vehicles were 8-hour day vehicles, and we used those for emergency coverage. Also, in amongst that, in 2012, that's when they changed the response time standards from just that one time in 1996 of 1554. They went back to the CTAS response time standards, and they'll talk to more of that in the March report. But that's where that was first developed in 2012. In 2013, because we were transitioning out of non-emergency calls, we added Dundalk nights. So what happened there is we took that 8-hour car, which was 2 FTEs, and then we upstaffed 2 FTEs to add Dundalk nights. In 2015, we added Craig Leith nights, and we used one more 8-hour car. As we were transitioning out of transfers, we used that 8-hour car. And not that we never not do transfers, but our abilities to do it were less. We used 2 FTEs for that and added 2 FTEs to get Craig Leith nights. And then in 2018, the last car that was left was an 8-hour car in Durham. Overall, most of their calls were standbys, and you can see that even in the ORH report. A lot of those calls were standbys, but they were only Monday to Friday from 8 to 4. So because most of those were standbys, and at the time we were actually having trouble meeting our sudden cardiac arrest, we'd actually fallen below 40%. So what we wanted to do by putting a first response unit in, we could keep vehicles in the more urban areas. And so when we made that change, we ended up with 1 person on 7 days a week. We had to add 4 hours, but not a lot of money to that. That gave us another unit to cover off through the week. Since that time, our cardiac arrest numbers have actually gone back up. We're meeting, and actually we're close to high 40s in the 50% range. So we've kind of been able to address that. In January of 2019, that's when Chatsworth opened, and at that time we had 3 units in Owen Sound, and we moved one of those units, a 12 to 12 shift, out to Chatsworth to cover off. And then in 2021, that's the first time that we didn't have any more resources to pull from to augment any of these upstaffs. That required 4 full-time equivalents to make that a 24-hour car in Dundalk. So just fast forward to today, like in 2022, we did 8,771 code 4s, which is roughly twice as many as we did in 2007. And our total call volume is 14,951. And now our transfers are only 2%. We went from 38% transfers, now we're down to 2%. But what you've seen is now all that we've lost in transfers has now been come back and then increased upon that with our emergency call volume keeps going up. And again, 2022 was our busiest year yet. So going forward, everything that we do to meet these response times, there's really nothing else to pull from the system. We've kind of pulled all that we could and tried to maneuver stuff around. And I think that's where it's like when we did this report, it's important that we get it right, because these resources are expensive. Like when you add a 12-hour car, it's almost $700,000 total cost. That's just for staffing. So we look at demand. Andrew talked about demand at 5.8% per year, 68% over the next 10 years. But he talked to it briefly, but I'm also aware that there's a lower end at 3.8% is also, if it doesn't come true, but there's also a higher end at 7.8%, which would over double our call volume in the next 10 years. So we will keep an eye on that, and we now have the AMSIM model to be able to model these types of changes. Before, a lot of the stuff that we've done, and I'm actually reassured by the report. Like I grew up here, I know this area, and the people that I work with know this area based upon the data we had and that type of stuff. I think we've made the right decisions, but having this SIM model is more than just your gut now and some data. Now it's actually modeling and evidence to be able to move this stuff forward. So as far as meeting response times, you heard him say that to meet in 2022, we need 252 hours. What they've recommended is more of a staging, a staggering and a phased in plan over the next 10 years. And what that looks like over the next 10 years is roughly 672 weekly hours, or for ease of looking at it's roughly 8 12-hour shifts of the staff 7 days a week. And part of that is there is some savings around switching the first response unit to an ambulance, so it'd only be half the staffing for that. Other operational logistical support that we need to think about is a base in Feversham based upon that recommendation. If it was approved by council, that's that was for 2025. And also we are at the busting at the seams for around inventory And if we have the opportunity to build in Durham, it would be better to build there while we're building to get more space for our equipment supplies. The other thing we have to think about as we grow is parking spaces. Where are we putting these vehicles to keep them inside? Also, scheduling support, more and more demand on the supervisors out on the road. But quite often on a Saturday afternoon, they're spending 2 or 3 hours filling a shift. And that's something we have to look at for evenings and weekends about supporting the supervisors so they can be out on the road, going to these responses and giving some off-hour scheduling support. There is a recommendation to add a couple supervisors to keep that 28-to-1 ratio. Back to the simulation model. As part of the work that ORH did, they provide us with the model, which they call AMSIM. And it really is a virtual replica, even right down to the fact that we gave them our GPS and AVL data. They studied how quickly we travel throughout the county in various seasons. So they built that into the model. So when we actually run a scenario, whether we change a base location or a hospital closes, or we add a car or move a car, we can actually run those scenarios through that. And it'll give us the outputs to show what difference that'll make. Like, for example, like adding 3 cars to Markdale doesn't change the response time, right? Because it's not really a volume problem there. But Grey Highlands is an area problem. You need to spread out. So you need to get something to spread it out versus in Owen Sound where there's lots of volume, you would see some benefits by adding an extra car here. So those are kind of things that we can ask the simulator those questions and be able to get that data back. So we look forward to that type of information. So just in closing, just want to thank council for their support in completing this work. I think the recommendations from the review will help us plan the next 10 years. I think in particular, we have to look at staffing and bases and vehicles. I recognize that these are significant enhancements and requests as we move forward, and they will need yearly budgetary approval and consideration. Even with the evidence based upon the data, we will need to continue to monitor these volumes and response time and adjust. And you can see that even the uneasiness in the room about, did we get it right? Did we not? It's not as if today we just walk away and say, well, we got the plan for the next 10 years. It's that at least we have a plan. We can see where we're at today. We have the low, we have the high, we picked the middle of the road, but we'll be able to adjust up and down. And I don't see us leaving ORH as long as you allow us be able to look to their expertise. That simulator should be upgraded every 3 years with the data. So like to be able to continue with that work. And as always, we'll continue to bring response times forward. Like my report comes in March, and then we talk about the plan again in the summer, and that's yearly. We do those twice at a time. We'll bring those forward so you'll be able to monitor that. But I really do feel that, something we haven't had before is a 10-year plan, and this is going to put us on the right foot for that. So appreciate the opportunity to be able to bring this forward.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you very much for your commitment to the service. You've done a tremendous job with this and yeah, a lot of work, and it will give us a lot of good direction in the years ahead. Questions from council? Councillor Mackey. Almost. I didn't. Councillor Mackey.
It's really not that hard, Mr. Warden. Thanks very much, Kevin. If council endorses these enhancements going forward, is there a sign off by the province? I mean, with our cost sharing agreement with the province, what does that look like as far as getting permission from them to make these enhancements or increases?
The model hasn't changed since we've made enhancements over the years that we've been here. Is that as far as like if you invest in the system, the only problem is, and finance can speak to this probably better than I can, but more or less my version is the first year that they don't pay. The second year is when they pick up that extra cost. So like if we put that money into the system, that in the second year, they will meet those 50/50 or as close as they could be to the $50/50.
Anyone else? Okay, not seeing any. All those in favor? That is carried. And I can see Councillor Nielsen is eager to go to lunch. I presume it's here, Madam Clerk. Yes, it is. And it is next door. Yeah, lunch is next door. So let's say we reconvene at 1 o'clock. All right, it is 1:07. We'll bring the meeting back to order. We have one item left, two items really, I guess, but one left on the agenda, and with the way we're working here is the report from Pat on the Holland Sydenham Town Line Bridge. So if I could have somebody to move and second that, that would be good. Councillor Mackey and Councillor Nielsen. Welcome, Pat. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. So this is a report on two structures on the Holland Sydenham Town Line, and there's been previous reports, as many of you know. So attached in some of the documentation is the presentation from the local community group, kind of stressing their importance of the bridge to maybe their agricultural operations and some of their safety concerns about alternative routes, for example, since the bridge has been closed in 2016. And then there's some closed meeting stuff in there as well. So I'm basically going to focus on answering the questions that came up in our last report. It was kind of left that we were going to do a little more research into the structure. The first being question one is in our old bylaws and the old evidence and things from Gray Roots and that type of thing, was there any references to the structure on it being ours? Did we work on it? Did we maintain it? Did we do anything? Did we do inspections? And right now there is, we found nothing of that sort. And our opinion is there's no legal obligation of the county with respect to structure 22. So we haven't identified anything saying, yes, we built it originally, or we went and fixed it once, or whatever. So that's kind of where we're at with that overriding question on what have we done with that structure. On to number two, it was just a question about liabilities and risks. So it's just the same thing, any asset you own is a potential liability. A closed bridge, people use them always. You can put a little blockade up, people go around if they want to go for a hike, or somebody in their four-wheeler or whatever, right? So leaving a structure closed for an extended period of time with us, we have removed them in the past. It just represents one of those things where there's no railings on it, kind of those. So it's definitely a potential risk. We went on to confirm just looking at confirming costs. So there is lots of evidence in there. You'll see it as attachments to the report. If you really want to get detailed, Burnside did an excellent report with 9 potential solutions, anywhere from, we were thinking with inflation, somewhere from 1.1 to 2.7 million, maybe, to fix the two structures. So they haven't done a ton of design, but they've given a lot of kind of options on what we can do. And some of those things, like there's some single lane designs in there. We don't have any single lane bridges. We've kind of, typically the traffic on our road is so busy, a single lane is not really an option for us. So we've kind of gotten away from that. So they've got options in there about whether they could do 2-lane bridge, another 2-lane, and it doesn't really go into, there's a lot of work on the road itself probably that needs to be done. There's a lot of single lane areas of the road. There's an EA saying it should be closed, so that would have to be reopened and somehow addressed. So it doesn't really go in detail into that kind of costs, but it's out there. It's something you have to do. So then question 4 was kind of the intention of Meaford and Chatsworth. Meaford's been very clear. They would like the county to adopt and fix structure 22. We talked to Chatsworth kind of at a staff level, and we've just heard, they're kind of waiting to see where we stand on things, and we haven't got a clear thing back from the staff that we've talked to, just briefly about exactly what their feeling is. Question 5, we were to look into maybe combine 2 structures into one. That's something everyone that kind of went out there said, well, they're 2 kind of other creeks, they're not, could we combine them together? So we asked conservation. It's preferred by them to keep 2 structures. And just on page 78, you'll see a whole list of the work you'd have to do, as far as design drawings, flow calculations, the hydrogeomorphologist you'd have to find and hire. And it just strikes us as one of those things that it wouldn't be real easy to get all those answers, and it might end up in a no anyway. So I think that's why the conservation is kind of saying you're better off keeping it 2 structures, because they're major enough water courses, I guess, that that they'd be recommend keeping them separate. And then the other questions we kind of addressed was there alternative options, like making it a private road, or maybe it could be handed off to an agricultural co-op who uses it for farm equipment, or I don't know. But we don't really have a lot of expertise in that. So we didn't really go very far down that road looking into that. Is there another option? Possibly, but it's not something we'd ever had any experience with, so. That's kind of where we're at with this information report. There's some of the questions kind of cleared up, or maybe have an inkling on how it's going, and that's kind of why I'm here, just to keep you up to date on where that is, that structure.
Thank you, Pat. And yes, thank you for the update. Are there any questions? Councillor McKay?
Yeah, just wondering, did they ever mention culverts? Or? There is.
Thing do you not say? Yeah, through this one. Yeah, they do mention some culvert options in there. So there's not a huge disparity on all the prices that the different options would have. But there's some good data in there for anyone that was so inclined to go in and really study it, I guess.
Councillor Mackey?
Thanks, Mr. Warden. Thanks, Pat, for the report and all the background information. It does kind of bring back some memories of some of the discussions that have occurred. That timeline was helpful. I guess I'm trying to, trying to determine, we were told, I mean, I know the county staff were out there doing measurements, and it's an old bylaw that the county has if it's over 20 feet, and there's some discrepancy whether it is 20 feet or whether it isn't. Were we able, first question, were we able to determine that it was over 20 feet? Or whatever the minimum requirement was?
Yeah, I did measure it. I mean, I got less than, but other people got more than. So it's kind of one of those things where, legally there's other things, the span is a factor, say. But because of erosion, was it built more than 20? Like it's around 20 feet, right? I mean, you can kind of get over, you can kind of get under if you were really determined to do it, maybe. Well, it's hard to get under. Can't really fake under, but anyway. So it's just one of those things. Like to us, it is one factor. It's approximately 20 feet, but there's a lot of other factors that show no indication of it being ours.
Thanks, Mr. Warden. Historically, I recognize that Meaford has always assumed the responsibility. Chatsworth came into the mix, I think, after, I don't know, we weren't part of the closing decision, so I know it was maybe 2018 or something that, we maybe became part of the mix. Prior to that, Meaford did believe it was entirely within their municipality. But anyways, things change, and we looked at boundary agreements, and this is a boundary road. It is a deviation road, which I appreciate the information supplied. The fact that it is a deviation road, but it's still a boundary road, and the county bylaw is based on municipal town lines. I guess my second question, just because it deviates solely into Sydenham, is it still a boundary road? Because that speaks to the Grey County bylaw for boundary roads and over the depth or the width of 20. Those two criterias, I guess. I know if there's some in-camera session materials that maybe we need to go in camera, Mr. Warden, because there is some legal opinions on that, but I think county council needs some clarity whether or not, based on those factors, it does meet that original bylaw that was established, I think, back in 1908. And if we're varying from that, I think there needs to be rationale why we're varying.
So I'm going to rely, because there was privileged information supplied to council through the portal. If we need to go in camera to discuss those items, we can do that. I'm going to rely on Michael to let me know when we're going to go in, or when we can go in camera, or if we need to. So maybe I'll start by asking, does council, excuse me, does council need more clarification on the material supplied confidentially?
Thank you, Warden Milne. I think Meaford would appreciate going in camera at this time if that's possible, so that we can have a fulsome discussion.
Okay, Madam Clerk, we're good with that? Are there any other questions related to Pat's report at this point? If not, perhaps we should receive the report and then go into closed session. Councillor McQueen? You agree with that? All right, all those in favor? That is carried. Thank you, Pat. So I'll take a motion to go into closed session. And we want Kim, Randy, Tara, Sarah, Kevin, and Michael staff to remain in the room. And Pat, of course, yes. Yeah, that guy too. So I need a motion to go in closed session. Councillor McQueen, Councillor Carlton. All those in favor? That is carried. We'll just wait until the. Very good. Thank you, Rob. We are now back in open session and I can report that we only discussed the item that was listed for us to go into closed session. So with Pat's report, we've had a closed session discussion on some legal points. Is there anything further that council wishes to discuss on that particular matter? Councillor Mackey.
Thanks, Mr. Warden. I think this, when council asked for this report to come forward, it was, way time flies, it's probably a couple of years ago now. We had a delegation from the agricultural community back in this area, and they highlighted a lot of the issues with the terrain. I mean, if this was flat ground, I don't think the request would ever come forward. It would be, we can't afford it, and we move on. We can drive around a concession block. There are issues back in this area with, quite steep hills. And it is at the request of the agricultural community, transferring, their crops at harvest time. And it's a safety issue, as they've told us in that presentation a couple of years ago. So that's really where the request goes. Chatsworth was not willing to write a blank check. When we first heard about this back in 2018, we weren't prepared to write a blank check. The whole environmental assessment process is very complicated, and they can give you a range, but they can't tell you, or we weren't told which option you'd actually have to go with. So, and those ranges were between $800,000 and, 3 million. So if I was being asked personally, would I support spending 500,000? I would openly say, yes, I would be. If I was asked to spend 2 million, I couldn't justify $2 million. So that was the issue Chatsworth Council had. We weren't told what that price tag would be because there's too many unknowns. So that's part of the dilemma here. I know Meaford's worked hard, and it is at the request of a lot of good agricultural people back in that community, and I certainly feel for them. I would like to see the county, at least between the county, Meaford and Chatsworth, get to a point where we could nail down what the cost would be. They're not asking for 2-lane bridges. They're asking for a way to get their materials back and forth between farmland. So that being said, if we could nail down what the options are, 50 years ago, you would have went in there and put in a couple of culverts. There would have been no oceans and fisheries, and the cost would have been minimal. But you bring in all these other authorities, and the costs are driven up, and it's affecting all of us that have a lot of bridges. We've got over 50 bridges in the township, and every one costs a lot more money because we have to do things differently. I don't know how long that's sustainable, but we got to keep most of them open. So anyways, my ask would be that our friends at the county here do help the agricultural community in at least investigating what potential options there might be. That would be the best case scenario. I don't think any decision could be made today, because we don't know what the price tag is. I would never sign off on a price tag that I wasn't aware of. Those are my thoughts, Mr. Warden.
Thank you, Councillor Mackey. Councillor Keaveney.
Thank you, Mr. Warden, and I appreciate your comments, Councillor Mackey, and agree, we have not established A price. And I think it behooves us now to go back and conduct a second EA process because a lot has changed in those years. And to come out with a problem statement that suggests that we want to get these bridges open and that we need a solution and hopefully an affordable one. And yes, it would be ideal if we could all work together. That would really please the agricultural community and certainly would please us in Meaford in particular. But I think there's information that we don't have in front of us right now that is required before we can make such a decision. So that will certainly be our recommendation back to our own council, is that second EA be completed so that we have something concrete to work with. And then perhaps we can come to an understanding or at least have an additional discussion about how we might move forward.
Councillor Eccles, you were next.
To Councillor Mackey, if you want another 50 bridges and then you would come close to how many West Gray has, would be welcome to give some to you as well too. You're very correct. Well, we can give some to Southgate as well too. I know Barb would certainly love that. So does a couple of other things. I hesitate for the county to get involved in this because of all the information I've heard, and certainly from Director Hoy. In my mind, the county's got no involvement. This bridge is one of those things that's close to a county or to a municipal boundary, but it's not a county bridge. And I leading the county into having staff go through and determine what the cost is and everything else. I'm going to look towards Mike and say it's almost leading us to a legal thing that, yes, we do pose some responsibility. I don't, and seeing all of it, I can't go there with that. The last time I think that the county was involved in one of these disputes might have been with another county to the west, if anybody can remember that one, and 2 municipalities. And the county was very clear at the end of the day, when the bridge was finally built, that it was absolutely not the county had anything to do with it. So understanding that municipality of West Gray in a lower tier has, I believe, I'll look to my compatriot, but I think we have 6 bridges right now that are closed. And the traffic volumes and the ability for commerce to continue on. It may be a slight inconvenience, but it's a greater inconvenience on the rest of the taxpayers to come forward to be able to maintain the infrastructure that we had built 75 to 90 years ago. And we can't maintain that. And in this case, as I said, the county, in my mind, as hard as it is not responsible for any of this.
Councillor Gregg.
Well, I agree with Councillor Eccles. I mean, we're representing the county here. We're not getting involved in what's a municipal matter. You could make a strong argument coming off Councillor Mackey's comments that there is a component of the Holland-Sydenham town line, a couple concessions to the west, which is a seasonal road. So if you had a member of the agricultural community purchases on one or the other end of that seasonal road, and there's a request comes forward for maintenance of that road through the winter, for upgrading, does it now become a county matter because it's a matter of convenience for the individuals that may live or benefit from such an upgrade? This is very similar. It just happens to be a bridge as opposed to a road that's only open from May till October. It's not county responsibility. I thank the materials I thank the individuals who have provided the materials. The materials that's been provided from staff is sufficient for me to generate my opinion off of. There's no need for any further investment from the county into this matter. And I'll leave it at that. I mean, I know individuals who have driven those hills with heavy trucks. They're not the world's best roads, but they're drivable. There's been an accident, but you can't blame an accident on a road detour in with any specifics whatsoever, especially if potentially there's charges laid resulting from the accident. So for those reasons, it's not a county matter. I don't think the county should be getting involved any further, and I'll leave it at that. I wouldn't support investing any further on this.
Thank you. Councillor Kentner.
Thank you, Warden Milne. I just would suggest to you that if this were an industry in Owen Sound that had been shut down by a bridge closure, and it employed 29 or 59 people, and it did $16 million a year in business, and the actual business itself paid over $1 million in taxes. I think that the county would be bending over backward to take a leadership role and bring two municipalities together and work collaboratively to try and resolve the situation. So agriculture is the lifeblood of Grey County. And I think we should, consider that fact before we turn our back on some very, very important producers in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kentner. Any further discussion? Okay, not seeing any. We'll move on. Is there any direction anybody wishes to take? Okay, not seeing any. Other business. Oh, wait, we have the terms of reference for the Ag Advisory Committee. Councillor McQueen, you asked that to have pulled, so I'll ask you to move that. Would someone else second that, please? Councillor Keaveney, rather. Councillor McQueen, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Warden, and thanks for your diligence. Going through this, we had a Grey County Federation of Ag meeting last night, and I know the recommendation is to take this terms of reference back to the Agricultural Advisory Committee for comments, or however they wish to comment. The comment that came back last night was so looking at the redoing of the terms of reference, and that's on page 63 of 81 on my device. I'm not sure how that works for everybody else. Certainly the warden and 4 members of county council appointed annually. Question about that, should that be for 2 years? The other one is 5 organizational members and then 5 public members. The part that sort of got a little bit of discussion was around Grey County will endeavor to provide notice of calls for membership to local stakeholder organizations such as Grey County Federation of Ag, Ontario Federation of Ag, Christian Farmers, National Farmers Union, and Grey County Agricultural Services where possible. So the discussion that came back from last night's Grey County Federation of Ag was it represents probably over 1,200 farmers in Grey County, the largest organization within Grey County, and which represents a lot of farmers. And to suggest that it possibly could represent, or the clarity is is the clarity here that it will include, which then will make this membership of 19 people, if I read that right. If I count the 4 and 5 and 5, and then Grey County Federation of Ag, Federation of Agriculture, Christian Farmers, National Farmers, and Grey County Ag Services. So that makes an organization of 19 members. Is that how it's being read? And is that the idea then?
I will ask Sarah to speak to this because it was her that was working on it.
Through you, Mr. Warden and committee, thank you for inviting me to address you today. Thank you very much for your questions. With respect to the warden's membership and the other committee members appointed to the committee, it has been our previous practice that because the term of the warden is annual and the committee appointments from members of council are handled annually, that has continued into this version of the terms of reference. With respect to your additional questions, it is intended to propose a membership of 15. So 5 public members, 5 organizational members, and 5 members of county council. With the understanding that while some local stakeholder organizations are recognized in this document, we want to leave flexibility within the language to encourage participation from other local organizations should some of these individuals not have capacity to participate in a given term, should interests change, items of that nature. So just not painting ourselves into any kind of requirements with respect to membership, while we do recognize the role and importance of these organizations to the local community and making sure that they are spoken to here.
Thank you for that, Sarah, and through you, Mr. Warden. Well, I would say that that's not going to probably fly very well with the Grey County Federation of Ag representation, just from the sense that it was sort of left out the last time. And I think probably the early days of the creation of the Agricultural Advisory Committee was probably at that time the chair, Hugh Simpson, with conversation with the CAO that brought this forward and was very instrumental of trying to bring this Agricultural Advisory Committee together. So as was iterated again last night, Grey County Federation of Ag represents over 1,200 farms, and it just seems to be that wouldn't be an automatic, that you would have at least an organization, part of your Agriculture Advisory Committee, that's representing 1,200 plus farms in Grey County.
Tara, do you want to weigh in on this, or please?
Sorry, through you, Mr. Warden. Just further to Sarah's comment, she noted that the membership, the intention of these terms of reference is that they were really opened up for the new term. There was a lot of consideration and feedback that we received over the course of the last council term from this committee and some outside stakeholders, that they felt that there was some representation missing. So that's been addressed, we feel, in this terms of reference, and it has opened up the opportunity for many stakeholders to apply. So I would just encourage all of those local stakeholders that wish to apply to please do so. And there is an application process that will be coming from economic development staff. So that is the opportunity and the spot to demonstrate the need for that representation on this committee from each stakeholder organization.
Okay. Oh, Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Warden, through you. And if I might just further add that the language in the terms of reference indicates that we give preference especially to organizational representatives that represent the kind of local sector stakeholders. So while not requiring specific organizations, we definitely keep in mind that local presence, and we'll be giving those preferential priority once we undertake the appointment process. So.
Randy?
Yeah, just further to Tara and Sarah's comments, and this is similar to what we did last time. We sent out specific when we opened up that application process, we notified all those ag organizations that the application process is underway, and encouraging folks to apply in terms of to make sure we have that representation. So we'll do the same for sure this time around, and we hope, like Sarah said, that we'll have representatives from each of those 5 key organizations that are listed in the terms of reference.
Councillor DeBreen, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Warden Milne, and through you. I did want to thank staff for responding to some of the concerns expressed in the previous term with regard to membership. They have opened up the number of individual organizations that would be represented on the committee. So I appreciate that. I can appreciate the difficulty in ensuring that the invitation to apply actually reaches the organization or the sector. And through you, Warden Milne, how is that invitation circulated? Is it simply we put it out on our website and hope that they see it, or do we target invitations to those organizations? That would be my first question. And second of all, the organization has to take responsibility for meeting the deadline. And my understanding in conversations with some was that perhaps they did not see the invitation in time and were overlooked. So I think my main question is how do you endeavor to meet those obligations of notification? Is there maybe more firm language that could provide a better commitment? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Sarah?
Through you, Mr. Warden. Yes, thank you very much for the question. By endeavor, staff intends to say that we will make all best efforts to ensure that local stakeholders and folks who are known to us and interested parties are made aware. We will be working with communications staff to make sure that the call for submissions is publicized. We are using our notice bylaw to kind of craft that structure and timeline. While committee appointments are not specifically spoken to under the notice bylaw, it is our kind of example for these types of things. And then our intention with naming some of these organizations here in the terms of reference is to acknowledge their history with the committee, their importance to the local context, and to say that we will be ensuring and reaching out to our contacts to ensure that they're aware of the appointment process and key deadlines and steps for submission.
Thank you, Sarah. Certainly, everybody now should know after the last term, because there was some oversights this time around, everybody's aware of the committee and spread the word by all means. Okay, all those in favor? Oh, wait, Councillor Mackey.
Thanks, Mr. Warden. So with these memberships or these applications for memberships going out, how will it be determined? Will it be the 15 voting members that have already been established? Will they make the determination on acceptance of new applicants, or how is those applicants going to be vetted, I guess, is my question.
Good question, Sarah.
Through you, Mr. Warden, thank you for the question. My understanding is that once the application period has ended, the submissions will be reviewed by key staff. So for example, our economic development officer specifically tied with agriculture, Philly Markowitz, and other kind of key county stakeholders to review where, assuming that we have an abundance of submissions, they will be ranked in accordance with the wording in the terms of reference, giving preference to representation from the local context, to ensure a variety of, for example, producers, suppliers, operators, owners, just making sure that those items are covered. And so with staff's expertise and the flexibility but guidance laid out in the terms of reference, we would then make a recommendation to council for appointment.
Councillor Eccles.
Thank you, Mr. Warden, and I'll make this brief. How many agricultural organizations are there registered or recognized in Grey County? Is the first one. We're going to take 5 of those, from what I understand. And it will come back. And it'll be a staff recommendation from what you've just said, Sarah. But it's this group right here around the horseshoe that makes that vote on who is going to be on there. So it is a campaign process. Okay, that's the first one, but out of how many groups do we have?
If I may, I think we used the number 5 to show the number of, general farm organizations that the province recognizes. And I think a report would come back to council should our numbers in some situation exceed the what's been proposed in the terms of reference. Otherwise, I think in the interests of time, we will simply roll forward, get a meeting set up with the people who have applied. That group then, once formally established, will have an opportunity to revisit the terms of reference again and suggest any adjustments that they'd like to see.
Okay. Sure. Now you've made me lose everything and I don't even know where I was gonna go now. Down the road, so we're only gonna go with the 5 farm organizations that are recognized, because I'm thinking beef producers, lamb producers, goat producers, apple producer organizations. Those ones are going to be in there as well. That's what I was looking for. My estimation in Grey County, there's probably 25, but the whole idea is we need some representation for this. The other aspect was, I'm not understanding in the motion why this is being sent back, the terms of reference, who's it being sent back? The county is organizing this group. Here's the term of reference. Here's what we want you to do. Like sending the terms of reference back to everybody out there to put their input onto it. It's like hiring somebody, come on in for a week, walk around the company here, and then you tell me what you're going to do for me. I thought that the committee were looking. I couldn't support the motion the way it is with it going back out. Here's the terms of reference. Here's what we want you to do to be able to bring back information for this group on the Ag Society. Sarah?
Through you, Mr. Warden. So a couple of things here. With regards to the timing, because this terms of reference proposes an increase to the number of members on the committee, we do procedurally want to ensure that council is supportive of that direction before we proceed with appointments. We don't want to give folks the idea that we have a capacity that we don't have. Also, the language within the terms of reference helps us guide our appointment process. I would say that it has previously been our practice to bring the terms of reference to the first meeting of the committee so that they are able to make themselves formally familiar with the document that will be guiding them in their work over the term, as well as give staff any feedback that they might initially have with respect to the document and its proposed wording. They are, of course, welcome to raise any proposed changes throughout the term as they become familiar with the document and their responsibilities on the committee. With respect to the questions regarding the number of organizational members versus the organizations present in the community, the terms of reference is currently proposed is in response to the community interest we've received thus far. And there's nothing limiting council to expanding that or, amending it in the future as staff receive expressions of interest. I think that designated staff representatives and designating organizational time and potentially, resources to have staff work on things can be a kind of a unique scenario to work out in an organization. And so this terms of reference just aims to recognize the expressions of interest that the county has received thus far.
Councillor Matrosovs.
Thank you. Thank you, Warden. Through you, the Warden, I could you please, could staff please clarify then, the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, that's to which I belong, so I'm a member of that. It's not listed as one of the stakeholders in the listing, but I know that it has no Grey County chapter. So my question through you, the chair, is this delineation between the organizational members and the public members. Does that mean if another member of the Ecological Farmers Association wanted to apply, they would need to be considered as a public member as opposed to an organization member? I'm just would just like clarification. Is that the delineation, that there's no Grey County chapter of our much smaller membership? Because I'm really appreciating the comments that have come from members of the Grey County Farmers Association about the 1,200 members. You know, I think that voice has to be there at the table somehow. So I'm just trying to understand, but I don't believe that the Christian Farmers Association actually has a Grey County chapter as well. I believe they operate more on a provincial basis. So could I please ask clarification? If somebody were part of a farm organization that is not within the list that comes in the paragraph afterwards, is it because they don't have a Grey County chapter, and would they need to therefore apply as one of the 5 public member spots?
There.
Through you, Mr. Warden, thank you for the question. The organizational list currently contained within the terms of reference is in response to the organizations who have previously had representation within the Agricultural Advisory Committee. The language within the terms of reference has been structured to allow other organizations to apply. It does not assume that any organization with past connection to the committee necessarily wants to continue forward. And the terms of reference aims to codify that we will give preference to representation for local focused organizations. And I would just further add that if somebody was a representative of an organization and they intend to participate in the Agricultural Advisory Committee to represent that view of a part of that organization, they would need to apply as an organizational member. However, if they are also a producer or a farmer or a landowner, with respect to the kind of priorities laid out in the terms of reference, nothing would prohibit them from applying under that hat.
Okay, thank you, Warden.
Very good, thank you. I think we've had pretty good discussion on this. We're not going to bury nuclear waste. We're asking for membership on a Ag Advisory Committee. So I'm going to call the question unless somebody stridently objects.
I didn't know that we had it moved and seconded, but I would move that, leaving out the word considered in the last sentence of the motion.
Yeah, it was moved and seconded, but I will take the amendment. Who would care to second that amendment? If anyone. Councillor Bordignon, sorry, I see your hand there. Thank you very much. Discussion on the amendment. Certainly, I'll get Sarah or Tara to read the amendment.
That the motion be amended to strike out the term considered in the 3rd clause. So it would now read that report received, that county council endorse the terms of reference, and that the terms of reference be reviewed by the Agricultural Advisory Committee at its first meeting.
Does that read the way you wish it to? Yep. Very good. I'll call. Councillor DeBreen, go ahead.
Through you, Warden Milne, the question on the amendments is that removing the word consider does not preclude the committee, the advisory committee, from making recommendations to county council in future.
That would be absolutely correct.
Thank you.
It does not preclude them. In fact, any committee could ask for change. All right, I'll call the question on the amendment. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? I'm going to call that carried. Okay, we'll move on. Any further discussion on the amended motion? Not seeing any, I'll call the question. All those in favor of the amended motion? Opposed, if any? That is carried. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah. Other business, any other business come before this meeting? Not seeing any notices of motion? Nope. Someone care to move adjournment? Councillor Carlton and Councillor Mackey. All those in favor? That is carried. We now stand adjourned. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.